of you who made it in today, and I'm very jealous of those who are able to listen online. I wish I could. Anyway, thank you for coming in. In a few moments we'll be having our main event, which is Mike Brown, who is the Transport Commissioner, and Simon Kilonback. First of all, just get through a few of the technicalities. So first of all, if I can look to Laura for any apologies for absence.
Chairman, we've received apologies from Assembly Member Sharp and Assembly Member Echeloni. Assembly Member Soter is attending as a substitute.
Lovely.
Assembly
Thank you very much.
McCartney is on.
Oh, right, lovely. Thank you. That's great. So can I also welcome everybody in the public and say that you're allowed to listen in, obviously, and record the events here, but we're not allowed to have any noise at all. So if you have your phones and you want to use them for anything, please make sure they're on silent for us. Thank you. Okay, and also those of you online, you can also take part in us through social media using hashtag Assembly Transport. Declarations of interest. The committee is recommended to note the list of officers held by Assembly members. Members are asked to declare any disclosable pecuniary interest in specific items listed on the agenda and declare any other relevant interest. Any takers? No? Thank you. Minutes. Can we confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 1st of February 2018? And to be signed by me? Agreed. Thank you. List of summary actions. Committee recommended to note the completed and outstanding actions arising from previous meetings of the committee.
Noted.
Noted. Thank you. And the future transport report. Committee is recommended to note the report. Future transport. How is London responding to technological innovation? As agreed by me under delegated authority in consultation with the Deputy Chair and Party Group Leaders. Okay, so now we come to the highlight of the morning. Mike, welcome.
Thank you.
And Simon, welcome to the committee. We're going to kick off with Caroline. A few questions for you. But, would you like to make a statement at all before we kick off?
No, I think perhaps just, Chair, to say thank you for the opportunity to come in front of you. Obviously, committee members will be aware of the publication of the final version of the Mayor's transport strategy, which I know you want to question on. We've been really delighted by having over 6,000 responses to the consultation, with some 43,500 discrete comments that we've taken on board in the resubmission of the final strategy. As members will be aware, the strategy focuses on healthy streets for healthy people, focuses on delivering a good public transport experiences, and focuses on new homes and jobs, which are all really important to London, and really important that transport is playing a key part in delivering all of those very important objectives. The strategy is not, of course, fully funded, as any strategy going out to 2041 will not be. However, it is important, and I know members will be aware, Chair, that the strategy sits within a hierarchy of that strategy to 2041, a 5-year fully costed and funded business plan. And then what you will see following our next board meeting, an annual scorecard process, which I hope will demonstrate to members that we have an annual process of tracking the objectives within the Mayor's transport strategy in a way that shows demonstrable progress on an annual basis as to how we operate and run the place. So I think probably that's the most I want to say on the strategy up front. The only other thing I would just allude to, because there has been some publicity recently about our financial position, I would just say that we are in a position for the second year in a row to have demonstrated significant reductions in our operating costs for the first 2 years ever in the history of Transport for London. That amounts to some 9% savings across our operational costs over those 2 years, which is actually in line with the very best of what you would expect to see in a private sector organisation. I think it's really important that we continue that trajectory to give confidence to Londoners, confidence, of course, to very important stakeholders such as yourselves, that we are ensuring that there is value for money for their transport services and what we're seeking to do going forward.
Would you like to comment on the weather at all?
Yeah, I could comment on the weather. I think just to say that we've got 100,000 tonnes worth of grit, salt, that we've been deploying across London's strategic road network in partnership with the boroughs. 39 gritters, all of which are low emission and therefore environmentally friendly. Those gritters have been fully deployed. We've kept the bus network working incredibly well over the last few days, and the operations team has really done, if you'd allow me to say it myself, a really stunning job in doing so. In terms of the railways, the underground has performed pretty well. Where we have had some blips, actually, it's been mainly due to some packed snow in particular sets of points that we've had to go out and manually clear, because although we do have point heaters around the open sections of the underground, they're simply not designed to be running 24/7, which they've had to be in this very strange situation where you need to walk through more London very carefully through more London to recognise that it is freezing over actually almost as quickly as it's been gritted. So that's a challenge. And actually we've had the odd issue where a bit unfortunately, like some colleagues of yours this morning, where people just haven't been able to get in, and of course that applies as much to train drivers or maintenance staff sometimes as it does to the rest of us. So I think we've done okay. We're never complacent. Just looking at the figures, as I did share before I came in this morning, the taps in and out on the tube network are some 20% down this morning on what you'd expect for a normal weekday. I suspect that's kind of in line with what you would expect, given that the National Rail operators, Network Rail, have made some decisions to invoke their network strategy, which reduces the capacity they allow the train operators to operate on. So far from complacent. And we'll keep our focus on it, but I was in conference calls late into last night and I had the first update at about 3:30 this morning, so I can assure you we're all over this at every level, as you would expect me to be.
Lovely. All right, well, thank you very much indeed. Caroline, would you like to kick off?
Yes, I'll kick off. It's great to hear about keeping the transport network moving in London. Let's pick up some of the issues around the transport strategy. Can you actually tell us what are the actual main changes in this new version? So I've been trying to wade through the document where you comment on all the responses, and constantly it just says no changes, no changes. So where can you just give us at a high level where you have actually made changes and listened to the 6,000 people who've got in touch with you?
Of course I will. So in the vision and relevant chapters, we've strengthened the narrative on the opportunities from new technology to ensure that innovations contribute to the Mayor's Transport Strategy outcomes and the public good. We've clarified the Vision Zero section so that it now applies quite rightly, I think, to the whole transport system. In the Healthy Streets and Healthy People chapter, we've strengthened the narrative and proposals regarding freight, following some significant input into that. We've clarified the proposals on improvements to air quality and mitigation against climate change to highlight that they'll be taking forward as soon as we practically can do so. In the Good Public Transport Experience chapter, we've strengthened significantly the narrative on accessibility and indeed the way we describe our bus services and bus priorities, including actually a revised map showing the plan for buses in Outer London, which I suspect we may get to later in the meeting. We've strengthened the narrative on National Rail in London, including station capacity there, interchanges, train service capacity and rail freight, which I think hadn't really had a mention in the first draft version. In the new Homes and Jobs chapter, we've set out the potential route and benefits of a West London orbital rail line in much more detail. We've added a new section on how extending the tram network to Sutton would support good growth in that part of the city. We revised the narrative around Southern Rail access and additional public transport provision to Heathrow, including a basis to consider some additional further options with Network Rail. Also in delivering the vision chapter, we've included a new section on mode shift in Outer London, referring to proposals from across the strategy which will contribute to that. Because I think we recognise actually that Outer London, the credibility of the proportion of journeys being 80% by walking, cycling or public transport relies on a different approach to Outer London boroughs than perhaps it does within Central London boroughs, and members will be very familiar with that reality. Of course, we've also responded to the very helpful input from yourselves as the Transport Committee. That includes clarifications on the Vision Zero section, accessibility and inclusion more generally, the map for buses in Outer London, and also the mode shift point in Outer London, which is something that we very much welcome from yourselves. And also the section on the opportunities for new technology to ensure that innovation can contribute in a very positive way to MTS outcomes and the public good. And then there's some other areas that specific boroughs have inputted into: Waltham Forest, Kingston upon Thames, Enfield, the progress being made there on the environment for walking and cycling as well. So I think there's been a sort of range of things that we've sought to do to enhance the both the content within the strategy, but also the credibility in terms of it covering very much the whole of London.
Thank you for that. That gives us a very clear idea. One of the areas that we were concerned about is having interim targets. You know, you've got this bold 80% of journeys by public transport, walking, cycling by 2041. You have now given us a little bit of a breakdown of how that divides up between walking and cycling and public transport, but not actual interim dates and targets. And that's something, it wasn't just from our committee, right across the responses. Why have you not chosen to put in those interim mode shares, which we think would really add benefit to this strategy?
Well, I think it's a very reasonable question. I think what I'm seeking to do, and again it goes back to the hierarchy I was discussing earlier on, which is that as you get into the properly costed business plan and you look at the 5 years of the plan, then that is really the opportunity to start looking at what those mode shares are. So let me just give you a couple of examples, and again we may touch on this later in the meeting. When you get the very significant increase in capacity that you get from the re-signalling of the Circle District, Metropolitan Hammersmith and City Line and the Tube, when you get the very significant increase in rail journeys that you can deliver from the opening of the central section, in particular of the Elizabeth line later this year, when you get to a greater deal of certainty, as I hope we will do, on the Bakerloo Line extension, on Crossrail 2, when we have the delivery of the extension of the overground to Barking Riverside, I think that's when you then start to be able to capture very explicitly what those new journey opportunities are and how they're created. And again, on the bus network, when you have the detailed plans for what we'll do in every part of Outer London, you then have the credibility attached to those numbers. So what I've been slightly concerned about not doing is creating something based on an assumption of interim targets with dates attached to them, rather than giving you some credible lines, if you like, connecting the objective, the strategic objective, with the actual ability to deliver that. So I think that will come. It just didn't seem to us to be the appropriate place to put it in a strategy that takes you to 2041 at this stage.
So are you saying that in the next business plan for 5 years, you will have a target within that 5-year period of where you think you will be getting to on this journey to 2041?
Well, I think it might even be better than that, actually, because I think, in terms of being before that, so I think when you see the annual scorecard, which will be quite a different process that will go to our board in March.
In March,
yeah. In March. That will, and we're just sort of finalising at the moment and working through how that might look, but I think you'll see that very clearly aligned to the Mayor's Transport Strategy objectives, and that will then give some very clear measurable outcomes on an ongoing annual cycle, including trying to get a better handle on the number of cycling trips, for example, and pedestrian trips. Now, this is quite complicated because some of these things aren't conventionally measured at the moment, so it's about how you develop a credible metric to be able to report back on that you know will be able to stand up to the legitimate scrutiny that, for example, you as a committee will want to apply to it.
So let me just be clear. So in March, you're putting out a scorecard, which is how you're going to be measured in delivering the strategy over the next year.
Yes.
Yeah.
Are you then able to, in the business plan, look at what it's likely to be for the next 5 years? So at least it gives us some way forward. If you can't go to 2041, you don't know when these projects are coming on, but at least gives us some way to see actually you're really slipping back there or you're ahead of the game.
I think that's very sensible. I think we'll certainly look to see how we can
to do that
present
in the business plan?
Yeah, I
Good.
think that's a very helpful suggestion. Yeah, thank
Okay,
you. Yeah.
super. And then one of the areas I know we've been looking at is motorcycle safety.
Yeah.
And you've removed a commitment to a London standard for motorcycle safety training from the strategy. Why is that?
Well, I think what we've been trying to do with motor is obviously work with the motorcycling community to ensure. I mean, obviously, motorcycle safety, you're quite right, is an increasing and major challenging issue. And what we've been trying to do is get the right approach to this. And I think we discovered there are very different views from different stakeholders in motorcycling, and actually just by being a little bit directive as to the specific application of a standard didn't to us seem to be the right thing following the consultation. So I think we're going to review exactly how we apply this, but that shouldn't be in any way taken as a reduction in our commitment to improve motorcycle safety. It's more about the methodology by which to get there.
You will still be looking at motorcycle safety training, but it might be a slightly different approach.
Very much so, absolutely. And apart from anything else, it's because there is quite a range of motorcycle users. So there's the whole range of an increasing number of people who are perhaps returning to motorcycling, who haven't ridden a motorised bike for some years. They perhaps have some slightly different requirements to, for example, the delivery companies that you see emerging who, there is a risk that they don't always have even the base level of training with quite low-powered vehicles, but nonetheless ones that can cause significant risk both to themselves and, of course, more vulnerable other road users, pedestrians and cyclists and others as well.
Sorry, so can I just ask
Yes,
for clarity then on that? So what exactly are you going to be doing to improve motorcycle safety?
Well,
then?
I think we're not quite firmed up on this yet, Chair. So all I'm saying is I think we discovered that in the consultation there were different views. There are different constituencies of users of motorcyclists in London, and it's important that we get the right tools, the right mechanisms to respond to those the quite disparate group of users on motorcyclists. So I think those plans will emerge in the fullness of time, and of course I will share those in detail with the Assembly when they do emerge.
And what do we think the fullness of time looks like?
I can't tell you immediately off the top of my head, but I'm happy to get back to you with some dates on that.
Right, I will look forward to that. Thank you.
Okay, and then I wanted to pick up the issue of road pricing, because what surprised me from the evidence we had from a wide range of groups, including the road lobby, if you like, was they all said road pricing is the only way to tackle congestion in the city and to allow London to keep growing and functioning. The Mayor's original consultation, he said that he was going to be giving consideration to it. In this final one, it says investigating proposals. So can you explain what the difference is?
No, I'm not sure I can, other than the fact that we are investigating this as something that may well play an important part in the overall objectives of the strategy going forward. So I think we recognise that, for example, the income from the current congestion charge system is down by some 5% in last year compared to where we've been before, because actually there are fewer cars coming into London. So I think, or more exempt vehicles, and I think therefore it is something that is incumbent upon us to have a look at. And clearly there are some policy decisions that the Mayor will have to make here, which it wouldn't be for me to comment on. But I think it is fair to say that we will continue to investigate what the art of the practical is here.
The word investigate proposals really means, rather than it's sort of vaguely there, you are actually going to be doing some work and looking at what options could be if the Mayor took a decision to move to that.
We absolutely are, and just to kind of reassure you further on that, actually things like the exploration, which I think I've touched on with the committee before, the exploration of the detailed type of technology that is available that allows you, for example, to apply road user charging in different environmental conditions, so different times of the day, different days of the week, or even perhaps on days where there's specific challenges with air quality in the city. So all of those are technologies that are increasingly available. And I think the word investigation just implies quite that we will have a proper look at all of those technologies that are available as part of this.
And also the work you're doing on the ULEZ, the technology, making sure it's interoperable, was one of our key recommendations.
Absolutely, that's a very important part.
And workplace parking levy,
yes,
that is also part of this mix, presumably.
It is, yes, and we will continue to have some discussions. Clearly, this is something that we would need to work very closely with boroughs on, and as often is the case in this situation, some boroughs are more interested in exploring this option than others. You know, there's other cities in the UK, Nottingham, for example, that have applied this, as you well know, applied this methodology before. So we're keeping very close to them and the type of approach they've had, and you know, whether this is a cost that sits with the employer or they pass it on to the employee, or how it works in practice. So very much so we're looking at this as a possibility as well.
Just because you've added in this West London orbital line,
Yeah.
which sounds very exciting, is that something that you're looking at workplace parking levy as potentially a way to fund?
Well, it could do. I mean, certainly not so much on the core West London route. There's another opportunity to potentially look at a sort of link into that from Hounslow, for example, which might give some real opportunities there as well. So I think this is all part of the same mix, absolutely.
Lovely, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think I've got two other members have indicated. Steve, you want to go?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, Mike and Simon, welcome this morning. First, I'd like to support the work you're doing on bus services now to London, and I think we need to do some serious work. For some years people have been talking about the rebalancing, but if the Mayor and yourselves are going to meet any sort of criteria around environmental issues, getting people to use public transport, you've got to significantly improve bus services in the outer reaches of London. But I'll turn predictably enough to the tram. You touched upon it earlier, and certainly it's getting near my 10-year anniversary, and others, of urging various mayors and various commissioners to work with Borough of Sutton, Borough of Merton to deliver the tram. And you know, on behalf of Sutton residents, as Sutton is, I believe, the worst served borough for public transport. And you know, if a person from Sutton was to look at a later paper and see spending of looking like 4.5 billion over 5 years on underground, which is no doubt to be welcome for people using underground, that's a lot of money. And people in Sutton aren't seeing that equivalent capital expenditure. And over those 10 years, we have quite properly seen improvements in transport infrastructure throughout London initiatives, and we feel down in the Sutton way we're left behind. So I was pleased that there was some narrative, and there always seems to be narrative around Sutton tram. Tell me more. Tell us more about how things are going. Is there an improvement? What's new?
Well, I think there is. I think there is actually an improvement, and as you know, I've been always, I think consistently. I'm sure the chair and deputy chair will tell me if not, but consistently cautious in raising expectations on the Sutton tram. But I think there is a real sense of some momentum behind this now, you know, both with the two boroughs that you mentioned, with Sutton and indeed with Merton on this, and I think there is an opportunity to continue to explore this moving forward. Obviously, we've got some realities of the local elections coming up, but you know, I think either side of those elections, continuing the dialogue with those boroughs to ensure that we can continue to jointly work on the case, work on how we might close such funding gaps as remain, so that we can get to a point where this becomes deliverable. Because I agree with you, by the way. I mean, I just, for the avoidance of doubt, and sort of echoing what the deputy chair, the question the deputy chair asked me around you know, outer London and the question that we were talking about a few minutes ago, I do think Sutton is one of those boroughs in London that has suffered because of geographical historical reasons that they aren't served by the underground, and therefore I think have had a pretty infrequent commuter service on the railway.
And they look longingly at the overground across to West Croydon, and there's a strong lobby of support in the Borough of Sutton for the overground to come there.
Absolutely, and I think, you know, we will continue to lobby. We'll continue. I'm meeting with the new Minister for London, the new Transport Minister, in a couple of weeks, and we'll continue the discussion again around. Haven't given up yet on the prospect of further rail devolution to ensure that we can begin to get to grips with some of those commuter routes in South London. So I'll obviously update members about that as it on goes. But that's not, you know, the only issue, and that's why I think the tram, particularly in terms of local connectivity and local growth opportunities, good growth opportunities, and housing, indeed, it's a really exciting prospect. So I think I'm probably in front of you, Steve, today more positive on this topic than I've ever been before.
Okay, that's good. I'm still trying to hear new things, because the narrative is there's conversation. Sorry to prolong this, Chair, just bear with me. There's been a long narrative of conversations between various deputy mayors, and we're talking about it, the leaders of councils and that sort of stuff. Whilst that narrative is going on, the funding gap is increasing. It's got about 100 million extra in the time that I've been thinking about it. Are we any nearer any further progress actually on the funding? Because the previous mayor ostensibly put 100 million. This mayor ostensibly took the 100 million out, but then replaced it out of 250 growth funds, which seemed quite interesting. Tell us just lastly your understanding of the funding and funding gap.
I'm not going to get into the detail of the funding gap, but I will say that we are getting closer. I honestly, and that's why I'm more optimistic. I really do think that we are on the cusp of doing something really exciting here. And the reason I'm not getting into the funding gap is because this is a slightly moving process at the moment, and clearly there is, as I say, these local elections involved as well, which require some quite complex discussion before and then after the elections. But I can assure you that we are working extraordinarily hard. Alex Williams and my team and the others in the planning team are working extraordinarily hard with the boroughs and with others to see what we can do to move this forward. So I'm really quite excited about this.
Thank you. So,
thank you, Chair. Just going back to the subject of road pricing, which there is, I think, a not entire consensus, but a broad consensus on this committee in favour of. I was quite pleased with the change in language because it does sound more proactive in investigating proposals rather than just taking consideration. I just wanted to sort of implore, and I know this is a political as well as a practical decision when it comes to road pricing, but implore TfL and the Mayor to get ahead of the game on this, because we're already seeing the Department for Transport bringing it in, I think, for HGVs.
anyway.
There is the possibility in future they could pull the rug out from under you, do it nationally, and we could end up in the same situation as with vehicle excise duty, where TfL is not going to get the same revenue benefit that it would if it rolled it out itself. So I wanted to ask you, do you think that by the end of, say, this mayoral term, you will have a proposal or a range of options that a future mayor, maybe in the next term, or the same mayor if he wins the election, could implement?
Yes, I'm hoping we will have just that, and that goes back to the point around exploring the various technologies, investigating the various technologies to look and see what we can do. So I am hoping that we will have a range of options that we can put forward, for the start of the next mayoral term, so that we can explore this. I'm slightly more optimistic than your question implies in terms of where London's position is this. I think London has historically led the way in this area, and actually it's sort of inconceivable for me that London wouldn't be at the forefront of any future decisions on this were a political judgment made to apply it. And I think, I think I'm optimistic we've got the contacts within the Department for Transport as well as what we're exploring more widely with the technology. So it's a very fair question, but I think actually we're quite up there at the forefront of this.
Just finally, do you have all the powers that you need under the legislation that you've got for the congestion charge, or do you need any further powers from the government? Is it just a question of technology?
I think it's a question of technology. I think it would depend on the reach of any sort of area that you were seeking to cover and how that played out in reality. But my understanding is we have the powers necessary. Clearly, it would have to be a consultation process in the normal course of events, but I don't think there's anything that legislation-wise prevents any mayor from deciding to do this.
Thank you.
Sure.
So just a small point on road pricing and the investigation you're doing. How closely are you working with central government? Because it strikes me if this becomes a national project and we have a different system, that would be a problem for us. So are we working very closely on the technology development?
I think we always try to work very closely with central government. I mean, and again, it goes back to the question I just answered from Tom, which is that, obviously London should be and is at the forefront of this thinking, and we must work closely with central government because London is, way and away the biggest city in the country by far. I think the only reason I'm slightly hesitant to your question is, when we've had things like Oyster Card and ticketing technology, it hasn't always been welcomed with open arms from a national perspective for some strange reason that I can't answer why. And so I would hope that central government will be cognizant and will be listening to our suggestions and proposals going forward. But you never quite know, because that they pursued for many years an alternative ticketing option where we had an oyster system that could have been applied nationally had the political will existed so to do.
And it's so still not taken off.
Okay, Chair, that's it. Thank
It's
you.
in New York.
Yeah, it is. It is around the world, just not around the UK. That's exactly right.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Move on to the next section, which is private hire. Dr. Silvertown.
My question is about taxi and private hire services. On February 2018, TfL published a new policy statement on private hire services, asking operators about certain practices. For example, ride sharing, providing mechanisms for passengers to decide who they will share vehicles with, like women-only vehicles, or ensure a minimum percentage of wheelchair-accessible vehicles, or sharing data with TfL. How can TfL ensure that that the minicab drivers do deliver on that? What powers do you have?
Well, I think that's why any changes to legislation and regulation would be subject to full consultation. I think there would need to be some legislative changes to allow us to do that, but you're quite right. I mean, it's really important that, and I should say this up front, the absolute imperative is the commitment to safety as the top priority here. So, this is for the safety of passengers, obviously, but also for drivers who often have to deal with some challenging and difficult situations. And I think the policy, the type of policies that we're looking for in terms of action plans for prevention and reporting of offences is really important. It's really vital, if you're going to get into sort of a ride-sharing situation, that you have the right mechanisms in place to allow passengers to choose who they share vehicles with, to assess the criteria by which they would be comfortable sharing a vehicle, because you don't want anyone to feel in a vulnerable situation. That has to happen before accepting a ride. I mean, I think that's really important in the technology that would be in place. And also the relevant insurance process, because insurance would have to change for PHVs, with contingency insurance for ride sharing and fleet insurance were appropriate as well. So, and also, you're quite right, you alluded to the very important issue of a minimum percentage of private hire wheelchair accessible vehicles being available to carry out bookings. So I think all of this is in the mix for what needs to go to the next step, and then would need to be consulted on, and would require, our view is, would require some legislative intervention to ensure that this was something that was, that there were powers to enforce and powers to ensure compliance with such a process. And I think that sometimes legislation is a challenge, and it's a problem. Actually, in this area, I would make no apologies for ensuring that we absolutely put a legislative backbone behind something that is so important for individual and more general public safety.
And have you had a discussion with the Transport Department about this, and how likely are we to see this legislation in the near future?
I haven't had detailed discussions with them, but I think what we need to do is almost go through the consultation process first to ascertain precisely, therefore, what legislation might be required. So there's a bit of a phasing process, I think, here to go through.
Okay, great, thank you. And the other thing was that private hire vehicles are currently exempt from the central congestion charge, and the Mayor was considering removing this exemption. Have you made a decision on this yet?
We haven't made a decision, but we have been exploring this, and we've been continuing to look at what we might do and what we might go out to consultation on, and I think that's something that we're still very much considering.
Do you have any sort of time scales
I
or
would
time frames?
think it would be certainly later this year, but it won't be any beyond that.
Okay. And the other thing, last thing, is that, of course, TfL is aiming to make all taxis to be zero emission capable by 2033. And of course, this means that there has to be more rapid charging points across London. And it also makes, based on the premise that to improve air quality, we need to make sure that there are 9,000 taxis are ZEC, I mean zero emission capable by 2020, right? What sort of progress are we making on that, and will we be able to achieve those rapid charging points by this timescales?
Well, I'm hoping so. We continue to work with local boroughs. There hasn't actually been the sort of progress that I would yet want to in terms of the number of rapid charging points. We think there is enough to operate at the moment. We've now got 14 of the new zero-emission black cabs licensed in London. I was fortunate enough to go up to Coventry to see the factory where they're made just before Christmas. There will be another manufacturer coming on board quite soon. These are extraordinarily impressive vehicles, I have to say, and I do think that from a public experience perspective, things like Wi-Fi charging points, the decent air cooling, and lovely visible roofs and everything else to see the great sights that London has to offer, really transformational. But you're absolutely right. I think the progress with boroughs hasn't been quite as it needs to be. I had a very constructive meeting with the Transport Environment Committee of London Boroughs last week, where Councillor Julian Bell, who chaired that meeting, and I had some discussion with the other members around how we might continue that progress with boroughs across the city as well. So not as much progress as we need yet. We continue to work on it. We've got some 75 rapid charging points in place, but we need more.
And then, of course, I can imagine a lot of charging points coming up in central London. But it's the outer London boroughs
it is
where the challenge is, right? And how do we make sure that those boroughs are delivering, right? And what incentives does the TfL have for that?
Well, I think that's precisely the discussion I was having with the local borough representatives, and I think that's the right dialogue to have with them. I mean, clearly there's only so much that we can do, although we can do some on our own estate, so in underground forecourts or in property or parts of the network that we actually own and can install these points. But clearly it's never going to be as successful as it would need to be unless we get the boroughs alongside us. And I was very encouraged by the discussion I had at that meeting last week.
That's encouraging, but I just want to make a point that Outer London does cause particular challenges, right? And that we often neglect Outer London at the expense of Inner London charging points.
Absolutely, and it's a very well-made point, and I hear you very clearly, yes.
Just following on to that point, I mean, is it any surprise that there are only 14 cabs on the road at the moment because of the lack of charging points? The 75 was promised by the end of last year. We're now in February. I believe the next target was 150, and you're obviously nowhere near that.
Yeah.
How can we expect these people to buy something if they can't charge it out?
I think first of all I would say on the zero emission cabs, I think there has been this is precisely actually the number I would have expected by this point, Chair, because actually when you're making a new vehicle of the type that is so different, I mean it will still have the iconic look of a London black cab, which is fantastic. But actually, when you're making these new vehicles, the LEVC, the company manufacturing them, it is going through a very rigorous quality and testing process, almost individual vehicle by individual vehicle, in the start of the manufacturing process, as you would expect, actually as any motor manufacturer or train manufacturer or anyone else would do at the start of the process. So I think gradually they will ramp up their production, and I do honestly believe this will be something that when people see it and feel it, there will be a huge drive for. So these things go in parallel. You're quite right that we do need more rapid charging points. We've got to where we need to get to now for the number of vehicles that are there, but we certainly need to do more. We certainly need to, as has been discussed, spread this wider around the city. But I think that this is going to, I have no doubt this will assume a momentum of its own in both parts.
I don't think it's a lack of supply, I think it's a lack of demand. Yeah, I think it's incredibly unfair that you're now expecting all new cabs to be this new electric cab, and yet you're not supplying the infrastructure to support it. That's really quite unfair on that trade.
Well, I think if by me not supplying it you mean me and the whole of London, then I acknowledge that. But as I say, this is something we have to work with the boroughs on. There is no doubt. There are only 4 on borough-owned estate at the moment, and that needs to increase hugely. As I say, I was extraordinarily encouraged by the meeting at the Transport Environment Committee of London Councils last week, and I think that gives us an opportunity to improve the momentum. So I don't want to give the sense, Chair, that the momentum isn't as I would wish it to be, or is as I would wish it to be, but I'm confident that following that meeting and following the absolute willingness of people to move this forward, that we will continue to make progress.
That isn't the point, though. The point is fairness, isn't it? If we knew that we needed X amount of rapid charges in order for these cabs to be viable. They should have been in place before you're forcing people to have to buy them.
We're forcing those to buy them if they're buying new vehicles. Let's just be clear. This is not forcing everyone to buy one at this stage. This is as vehicles are replaced. So, as I say, I think the numbers at the moment allow this. And, of course, technology of how much range these vehicles have, what I consider actually the value for the individual black taxi owner and operator is quite significant in terms of the types of savings you can generate because of the new technology they're using. But you know, I don't want to appear complacent in any way. We certainly need to do more, and that's precisely why we had the discussion with the boroughs last week.
I'm not going to labour the point, but it is a particularly good vehicle. I've been in one. They are very, very good vehicle, and definitely there are savings for the owner drivers to be made. But they can't make those savings if they can't charge the thing. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. I've got a number of people who've indicated. Caroline, you wanted to come?
Yeah, just wanted to pick on the last thing about you've only got 4 on borough estate, and there is an issue with the boroughs delivering these as well as TfL. Are you looking for any legislative change to make it easier for you to install rapid charging points across London?
I believe it's something the Mayor has considered as to whether that might be something worth doing. You know, as ever, that would be an issue for the Mayor if he wished to do so. But I think that there's probably a parallel stream that you consider such a possibility while also having the dialogue. Because in my experience, the quickest way to get these things delivered is by the power of persuasion and argument and discussion, as I said, I've had with them.
The TfL isn't pushing for any amendments to legislation?
Well, no, I think there has been some consideration to look at it, but I don't believe that's actually materialised yet.
Right, okay. And just on the private hire vehicles paying the congestion charge, Val Shawcross, when she came before us last month, did say there was going to be a consultation later this year on that. So is that correct?
That is correct, yes. In fact, sorry, I was in the wrong place in my script when I asked that question. That is correct, yes. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. David.
Yeah, thank you. Morning.
Morning.
Yeah, so just going back to the number of vehicles which are now licensed as ZEC. You said 14 so far, but I understand that you would like to have 9,000 licensed by 2020. Is that the beginning of 2020 or the end of 2020?
Is by the beginning of 2020, yes.
So there's another 22 months to get another, still nowhere near 9,000. I mean, how realistic is that target?
I think it is realistic, not least because from a manufacturing perspective. So obviously we've had the discussion about the charging points, but from a manufacturer perspective, as I say, the early stages of the production line is quite slow. I mean, in Coventry, I've seen it. It is, the way it works is they're doing literally this detailed check of every single vehicle. Every single vehicle is laser checked on some sort of simulated shell. I mean, I can't comment on the technical detail. It's beyond my sphere of knowledge, but it was incredibly impressive, I have to say, what I saw from the quality control perspective. But then what happens, as they refine and adjust the manufacturing process, then they are able to start rolling these off as a standard production line, which actually they start rolling off very quickly. If you add that to the fact of a second manufacturer with a compliant vehicle also having the ability to produce vehicles on offer, I think this is credible because vehicles can roll off quite quickly once they are once there's the production line process involved.
Taxi drivers who've got a vehicle that's 15 years old now aren't allowed to use it anymore. They have to replace it with a ZEC. What are you going to do for the taxi drivers who are now in that period where they have to replace their vehicle, and there's hundreds or thousands of them this year, but won't be able to buy a ZEC, perhaps because in the last couple of months there haven't been any available for them?
There will be enough available. The timeline is such that there will be enough available. That was one of the reasons I wanted to go and talk to the manufacturer to assure myself of just that, and I am assured that will happen. I mean, this ramps up very quickly when it happens. I mean, you're talking, several hundred potentially coming off every week on the production line. So this is quite a significant ramp up from the original production process.
Well, my point is, maybe that will happen in the future. I don't know if that's happening right now.
It's beginning to happen right now as we speak, yeah. So I was there in November, and actually this is when they were going through that early stage, and actually the plan was to early in the first couple of months of this year to ramp up. I haven't had a particular detailed update before today's meeting. I'd be more than happy to give you some offline updates as to how many they are producing now, if that would help.
Yeah, that would be very good. Yeah,
sure.
Thank you. I do also think about the cost, the extra cost of the vehicles to taxi drivers. I mean, the TX5, I understand, costs about 65,000, whereas the TX4 was only 46,000. So that's a huge increase in the price of the new ZEC. I mean, a lot of taxi drivers just simply can't afford it, and those who are coming up to retirement aren't, just maybe deciding, well, we can't afford it, we're going to retire. I mean, how are you going to make sure that all taxi drivers can afford this and won't have to pay any more for the huge extra cost of the new vehicle?
Of course, the manufacturers do allow a sort of funding arrangement that in the same way that anyone buying their own private car is allowed to have a funding arrangement where they pay a certain amount every month to contribute towards the purchase of the vehicle. And actually, if I look at the evidence of how much you save in fuel costs because of these cleaner, greener vehicles, then actually very quickly you get you recoup the charges. This is in standard normal operation. This is what's considered in standard normal operation. Of course, we need to keep that under review. We need to make sure that's credible in the reality of what people do in driving these vehicles around London. But actually, I'm confident that this is a good business proposition for anyone buying one of these vehicles.
That's assuming that the cost of buying electricity from a charging point is cheaper than the cost of buying petrol or diesel.
It's based on current assumptions, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
One more question. There's the demographics of the taxi driving industry is such that there's more sort of people in their 40s and 50s, not so many in their 20s and 30s. There's a few coming in. I think we really need to look at promoting the knowledge to younger people, particularly with the push for apprenticeships at the moment, coming from Westminster. What are you doing to promote the knowledge to younger people, which would be a fantastic opportunity for them and to keep the trade going? I mean, it's a win-win-win situation. I mean,
well, I agree, and I think I'm extraordinarily proud of the knowledge and of London's black cab trade and the drivers in London who are a hugely professional quality service that they offer as part of London's more broad transport offering. I think it's a fantastic service that they do, and I'm certainly asked the team to consider what more we might do in line with the suggestions you make. And I think the question of apprenticeships is a very well made one, and we should certainly look at that. Okay. And not least, actually, by the way, if I may just add one thing, to ensure that increasingly taxi drivers are as diverse as possible as well and represent the city, particularly in terms of the number of women who feel able to pursue that career as well.
Okay, thank you.
Right.
Morning, Jack. Just before I ask my questions, which will be about the finances of TfL, so warm yourself up there, Simon. Just to talk about the taxi driver, it strikes me that most of your comments have been about the supply of these new taxis, as great as they are. I worry about the demand for them, because if I'm a taxi driver who's effectively a small business having to make that decision, do I take on this huge capital cost? If you're not providing the charging points, I can't do that, can I? That's why I think it is so important that we do both things in parallel. Of course, individuals have to be confident there will be the right charging infrastructure in place. So, as well as the sort of conversations with borough representatives, it's encouraging individual boroughs to look at on-street residential charging infrastructure, the Go Ultra Low City Scheme funding to prioritise requests from taxi drivers switching to the zero emission capable taxis for charge points is all part of this discussion. So I think I recognise, and again, I don't want to give the sense in any way of being complacent here. I recognise this is something we have to continue to push on both counts, both in terms of the availability of the number of vehicles, but also in the credibility from an individual taxi driver perspective that they will have sufficient facility to charge. So I do recognise the challenge, but I'm confident we'll get there. I don't want to labour the point, but I do think we need to see those charging points, because I can't see a taxi driver taking that risk, which is a huge financial risk.
I would just say I'd be extraordinarily grateful for any support Assembly members could give with boroughs that they cover as part of their constituency or London-wide. If that's the case, that would be extraordinarily helpful to me.
I'm sure my colleagues will willingly give that. But let's move on. I address these comments to both of you because Simon may have to give slightly greater detail. Could you explain the financial pressures that TfL is facing and how you measure the impact of the decision to suspend TfL's road renewal programme?
Well, let me just give a couple of headlines. As many of you will know, that the first thing I did actually when I took over this role was to set up a review of our business and finances, and it was less than a year later when the mayor was elected, and we had a discussion then about how we needed to transform and modernise the way that we work, looking at our structure, our organisation, our culture, and indeed, very importantly, our commercial arrangements, because it is worth pointing out that 75% of Transport for London spend is with external suppliers who do some of the big engineering projects, do some of the big pieces of work that is required to modernise our infrastructure. But as I say, and as I said in my opening comments, I'm confident for a second year in a row we are going to have reduced like-for-like operating costs when we get to the end of this month, now the end of March. That's despite rising inflation, which obviously puts pressure on our wage costs and also our relationship with our key strategic commercial partners. So overall, we have realised over £700 million worth of savings cumulatively in these 2 years. That's 9%, as I said earlier, of our operating costs. It is true, though, to say that the pressures on our financial situation exist because of the removal from a high of about £2 billion in 2012-13 in operating grant from the government to zero for the start of the new financial year next year. The budget that we published shortly before the 2016 election showed that our operating deficit would have peaked at 1.033 million if we hadn't done anything, and would still be 572 million at the end of the plan. So it wasn't until we got the new business plan under the new mayor, having had the discussion around the importance of tackling our costs, that we had a credible pathway to deliver an operating surplus while delivering all the strategic aims in the mayor's transport strategy. Now, the other thing I would say is that things that have changed mid-year, during the year that we're in at the moment, mid-financial year, clearly the increase in passenger journeys that we had predicted, budgeted for, didn't materialise to the same extent. Although actually the latest numbers we've got, Simon, show that journeys will be broadly flat year on year. And bus income has certainly stabilised year on year and is ahead of budget. We couldn't have predicted, none of us could have predicted the terrible events, for example, at London Bridge and Westminster Bridge last summer that did have a material impact, particularly on our discretionary leisure, evening and weekend travel on our network. I would say also that the mayor directing us to freeze fares has had a materially positive effect, because there is no doubt, if you look at the evidence now, that it has actually cushioned our demand decline compared to the real numbers of decline we've seen in the train operating companies serving London. So actually, given that Londoners benefit hugely, by 2020 the average London household will have saved around £200 thanks to the mayor's fare freeze. That's real money that allows people to make...
That might be correct, but what effect does that have on your budget? Because that has a cost to you.
No, I don't believe it does, because if you look at this there's two ways to look at this. There's a demand encouragement way, and there is a cost of individual travelling. So individual travelling, yes,
there's a cost to your budget.
Well, people may pay less for an individual journey on our networks, but actually, as I say, there is evidence that more people are making journeys than would otherwise have done so had there not been the fares freeze.
That might be fine, but is there evidence that it is increasing your revenue intake?
I think there is evidence quite clearly now emerging that if you look at, and we do compare ourselves to the train operating companies that serve London, there is evidence that the slight softening of demand that we've seen in rail travel into and around London including London Underground, actually there is evidence that London Underground has done better, as has London Overground. So the bits that we control have done better than comparable train operating companies.
But have they done as well as you imagined they would do before the fares freeze?
Yeah,
when you forecasted your income?
Yeah, they've declined much more significantly than we've declined based on the fares freeze. That is our assertion, that's our assumption. I think there's increasing evidence to back that up. So, but can I go on to the roads funding point? Because you made the point, sorry, and I didn't mean to not answer that question, but just let me go on to the roads funding point. There is, so the income we get for roads from the start of next financial year, because we don't get any share, or we won't get any share of vehicle excise duty, unlike every other part of England, with Highways England getting a share of vehicle excise duty to maintain the strategic road network. Once a road crosses into central London, the A2, the A3, the A40, whatever that road is, we do not have any money available for maintaining that strategic road network. The income from congestion charging, as I alluded to earlier on, has gone down slightly, which is good because we're seeing a reduction in the number of people travelling into central London by cars, those that aren't exempt in any way. And that does mean that we've got a real challenge with how we are able to proactively renew the asset that is the strategic road network. So just to be very clear, Chair, and it's important I make this point through you, but to be very clear, we are not, and I will not countenance any issue that presents a risk to road users, particularly to cyclists in vulnerable parts of the city. So I won't countenance a degradation in the surface of the road that would affect a cycling lane, a dedicated cycling lane, or on the main carriageway where there isn't a cycling lane on our strategic road network. However, it is inevitable that if you don't have the money to spend on the road network, that there will be, over time, a deterioration in the underlying condition of that road network. Because we simply don't have the funds.
Doesn't that mean you're storing up problems? It means
it
gives you attention for your first contention.
It is. It does mean we're doing that, and that's why it is so ludicrous of this inconsistency, if I may say, between all the roads in England apart from in London.
Okay, I just want to circle back to this fares freeze. To be clear, so you're comparing your performance to train lines that you don't control and their drop in finance. I'm asking, when you forecasted your own income before the fares freeze, does the fares freeze constitute a lower income against your own forecasting for your own income, not comparable to somebody else's?
No, actually we've done better. I mean, the fares freeze has actually genuinely made an impact on people and their choice of journeys. And you know, if you add that, it's a bit difficult to disaggregate all of this, I'll be honest, but if you look at also the fact that we've now got the universal hopper in place, which is a really significant change in how people are able to travel round, and again encourages people to potentially make more journeys. We've seen a real shift from people from buying travel cards, which of course is a apportionment of the fare goes to the national rail operators, and shifting to pay as you go, which is of course based on our fares process. So there has been a shift in behaviours here. So there's a number of variables that have emerged since this initial decision was made. But actually I think there is increasingly evidence, as I say, that people are making decisions based on real differences to what money they have in their pocket.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, and I was going to say, and more than that, Mike, if we're going to hit the 80% mode share target over time, we've got to make public transport more attractive than private transport. So any normal organisation would look at its pricing and look at ways that you can encourage people to use public transport. So that is absolutely key within the affordable fares policy. You've got to make it affordable if we are going to attract more people out of private vehicles and onto public transport.
That's absolutely right, but of course we have capacity issues and range issues, and there's a relationship between the fares and our ability to invest. I just want to ask a slightly more detailed question. The original estimated cost of the fares freeze was £640 million. Is that correct?
Yes, back at when we were asked to estimate that at the start of the Melty, that's correct.
Thank you. Given the higher rise in inflation, is there a new updated figure?
Not that I have to hand, but we can certainly come back to you with one. So what of course, it's the income assumes passenger levels as well as the fares piece. So the complication is, although inflation itself may be higher, given that we have seen some reduction in numbers of growth of passenger journeys, and we've rebased our 2017 business plan to a more cautious forecast of growth, because we think because we've reduced the forecast of passenger growth, there would be a lower impact over these 5 years than the 640 million when you look at the net effect of both inflation and passenger growth.
Just to put it in some sort of context, we reckon broadly, and Samuel will share the figures with you, I have no problem with that, but we reckon broadly the removal of the revenue grant from the government of 700 million on average per year, which is where we've got to following the high level of over 2 billion that I talked about earlier, 700 million per year, that's more than 5 times the cost of any fare freeze, even if you net off the benefit of the fare freeze in terms of stimulating new demand. So the discussion, you know, and by the way, we are the only Western Transport Authority now to operate with without any operating subsidy. We're going to see the Underground alone within the next 5 years as being the most efficient in EBITDA, private sector terminology terms, of any metro anywhere in the world. So we are doing everything we can to reduce the cost and ensure that this place is fit for purpose financially. But frankly, not to be given any money when we have no income for the road network is really a strange reality that would in extremis mean you were cross-subsidising fare payers on the tube, were cross-subsidising to maintain the road network, which from any transport economics perspective is insane.
Okay. When the Hopper fare was launched, it was estimated to be 30 million. That's the cost of the TfL expected. The Hopper journeys per year. Given now that there are 100 million journey per year, has 100 million journeys that are benefited from the Hopper, how much did all this cost?
So we still think that it's costing us about 30 million a year, because what we've seen as partially an effect of the Hopper is the recovery in the bus patronage, which has been falling year on year for the previous 3 years. So it's helped us attract people back onto buses at the same time as the improvement in bus speeds themselves have also helped attract people back onto buses.
I think the other thing, sorry if I may, forgive me, I don't mean to cut across you, but forgive me, but the other thing, of course, that the assumptions were based on in terms of the strategic view going forward was when we had the multi-hopper in, and that's been quite recent actually that we've had the multi-hopper introduced, and already we've seen some 485,000 journeys on multi-hopper. Weekday average of hopper overall is some 300 and the wider hopper is 384,000 weekday average. So actually we're beginning to get a clearer perspective of how this might emerge, but I still think there's more potential for multi-hopper use as people get accustomed to the reality that this can happen. So I think there's still greater potential here.
How much longer till you get a clear picture and some financials, some figures around the effect?
The really important thing is to have a full year of data. Okay. So with the multi-hoppers only just come in, so it will take us a year to see the overall effects come through. Okay.
And what planning was done for the removal of the grant? Because sometimes in discussions people act like it's a surprise. Everybody knew the grant was going. What planning was done for that?
We obviously have planned on an ongoing basis for various scenarios and for various discussions. Of course, we've continued with dialogue with the Department for Transport for some considerable time. Simon, indeed, have been talking with Treasury officials as well to ensure that they continue to get the message, and we continued to be hopeful that we might get some recourse from a full removal of this grant. But of course, our business plan had to be predicated on producing a budget that was balanced for this year and for subsequent years and is credible, and therefore we have been, of course, planning on that basis. But and that's why we've been having some discussions with those who are involved in highways maintenance on our strategic road network for some considerable time now.
Okay, thank you. I think that's me, Chair.
Thank you. I've got a couple of people who'd like to come in. Tom.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, we've got a briefing that it's anticipated there'll be an increase in the proportion of TfL walkways in need of repair or renewal from 4.6% to 10.1%. Are you anticipating additional costs if anybody were to sue TfL because they were tripping or on work hadn't been done?
Well, again, I think just to be clear about the distinction here, there will be parts of the infrastructure that will require work, but my aim is, and the aim of the team that we've had a very clear, detailed discussion about this, is to keep it absolutely in a good state of repair. That is slightly different to being able to sort of dig under the surface, if you like, and ensure that all the drains are replaced, all the underlying core of, as you know, when you construct a footway or a roadway, there is a series of layers of infrastructure that exist underneath the pure surface. So in a sense, there's an element of patch and mend that we will have to apply here, which isn't best maintenance practice in an ongoing basis, as was implied, but actually that's what the best we will be able to do at the moment. But my aim absolutely is to keep this safe, and I in no way am going to countenance the teams not addressing things that have a safety imperative.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, this discussion on financial pressures really has been very much on the narrative, the discussion that you want to put out there and the points. But the reality is you are facing an operational deficit of nearly £1 billion next year, quite unprecedented. What specific things are you doing to plug that gap? And is there going to be a risk going forward to capital expenditure?
Well, on the second point first, I'm confident not, because actually the capital expenditure is hugely important if we're going to continue to meet our objective, as we described earlier on in the section on the Mayor's transport strategy. So, for example, the procurement underway right now for new trains for the Piccadilly line, which alongside new signalling will give us some 60% increase in capacity on that line of route. The hugely ambitious plan we now have to increase, a very important plan to increase the number of accessible stations we have on the tube network, bringing this up to 40% by the end of the plan, which is hugely important alongside the new Elizabeth line. So I'm really determined that we continue to deliver the capital plan. It is important that we continue the trajectory of modernising our network. So if I just give you some examples, the Mayor set out quite clearly when he was elected the fact that we needed to avoid duplication and waste across various parts of TfL. And you as a committee have been, certainly you, Deputy Chair, consistently as an individual, have been quite rightly challenging of us down the years as to some of the things we could do better. We now have one engineering function sitting and covering the whole of Transport for London for the first time. We are ensuring that we run our asset maintenance processes in a way that recognises the significant capital investment we have had and continue to have in new assets, because clearly when you've got digital assets you have a different skill set and a different requirement for maintaining those assets than you do the old electromechanical assets that existed before. So a huge amount of work still to do there, but I also, and Simon might want to touch on this a bit more, I don't want to underplay the challenge of working with our strategic supply chain as well. It is really important that we are considering all areas of expenditure with some big strategic suppliers, and these are big organisations. So I meet regularly with the chief executives and senior teams of these, sometimes global suppliers, to ensure that they fully understand the pressures we are under and the opportunities that exist for them to work differently with us in terms of delivering some of these savings. Some of it can be helped in terms of initial challenges year on year by some phasing issues. So again, Simon may wish to comment more, but we historically as an organisation have been an extraordinarily diligent payer to suppliers. Now that's good at one level, but actually it's not commercially good practice, to be honest. It's not that you want to see a supplier in trouble. Of course you don't, particularly small suppliers. You want to support them, but equally you have to pay when you get the delivery of an asset that works to the standard that is required, not as soon as it leaves the factory. It's not quite the same thing. Did you want to comment more?
Yeah, but sure. Let's just really understand, because some of this stuff was already done. The engineering we've heard about, we're 2 years into this mayoral term, and that was one of the things.
But it's not done yet. No, it's not done yet, for the avoidance of doubt. Some of this doesn't deliver the actual savings until next financial year.
Does this operational deficit figure take into account those savings?
Absolutely. So, the 968 million operational deficit was fully planned for and fully funded in our published business plan from December last year. We have granular plans in place to deliver savings. So, as Mike touched on, 75% of our spend is with our external supply chain rather than on the people that we employ. And the focus for the first 2 years has been putting in place a fit-for-purpose, efficient and an effective organisation. But from this year going forward, the focus turns to driving out savings in our global supply chain. And there are some examples of that, such as the exiting a private partnership maintenance contract on the London Underground, which will save over £200 million over the course of this business plan. And there are multiple examples of how we will be more disciplined and procure more effectively, working together with our suppliers to find cheaper, better ways to deliver efficient outcomes.
And finally, is there a factor in here? I realise it will only be the end of the financial year, but obviously Crossrail will start running, so then you've got a running cost. Clearly, there will be some new passengers from that, but also there'll be some passengers switching from one mode to another. Is that actually going to, in the first year or so, cost more than, it won't cover its costs, as it were?
Yes, that's right. There is an operational deficit in the first 2 years.
2 years.
It's we start to really get income coming in from December 2019 when the full route opens, but it's from 2020, 2021 onwards that you get the full ramp up of passenger numbers, and that's always been in our forecasts. And that is built into the trajectory you see in terms of the increasing income in our business.
Revenue costs coming in that you won't cover.
Well, yes, and you're quite right, because by definition with new lines, you often get the attrition in the first phase. So attrition of people moving from particularly the Central and Jubilee line, I guess, when the core central section opens, and then it's the growth that you get to after that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Right, thank you. Just a couple of quick questions. First of all, you said earlier that the fares freeze stood to save on average a family £200. Could you give me the metrics on that? Like who? Because I can't believe that you're saying every Londoner will. Clearly, it's only the passengers. So, how do you get to that number of £200?
Maybe it's every passenger. But it's certainly we reckon 4.5 million people benefit every year, and something like well over 80% of Londoners benefit to some extent from the fares freeze, given the way that people travel in and around the capital. But I can give you some more detailed breakdown of that, Chair, offline.
Just give me the metric, I think that'd be useful. But in light of what you're saying, that the fares freeze has actually generated more income and also increased ridership, as I would call it, I don't know, or more passengers on buses and trains. More. Does that mean that you'll therefore be proposing a fare cut to the Mayor?
I think, as ever, fares are a matter for the Mayor to decide. I'm no doubt we'll continue to have dialogue with the Mayor and his team and any future Mayor going forward.
You would have, I don't think we're telling any stories out of whatever, you would have had a conversation with the Mayor before the election to assist him on his proposals in relation to the fare freeze. There was the Mayor did promise to cut the bus fares, but he didn't do that. So I'm sure you would be advising the Mayor, wouldn't you, whether a fare cut's a good thing or a bad thing?
As we sit at the moment, as I say, the fares freeze, we think, has had a cushioning effect on some quite challenging situations that have emerged during this financial year. Clearly, every year is different, and we'll continue. I think it's safe to say we'll continue to keep this under full review, of course.
Yeah, if I may, Mike, I think what we would be much more interested in doing and are actively working on is further offers to incentivise people to travel, such as the hopper and the unlimited hopper. You know, they are being seen to be very effective and things that any normal business would do.
So can we look forward to a 2-hour hopper then?
We're certainly looking at all options to try and get more people back on buses and increase ridership on the tube. So we're looking at all options.
Right, thank you. So you're going to write to me about the fare.
Well, we'll give you the detail of that. Yeah, sure.
Lovely. Thank you very much. So now we go to Assemblyman Copley.
Thank you, Chair. I just had one I forgot to raise earlier on the TfL finances before I come to bus services. You're setting up TfL Consulting, which is going to be this international body. When do you anticipate sort of seeing? I know it's probably difficult to say, but we're seeing revenue coming in from that.
So we've appointed a new head of consultancy. I'm not sure it's been announced yet, but we have appointed somebody to take on that role, which is really good. And I think that person starts in I think she starts in May,
yes.
May, which is really good. So I'm very excited about that. And clearly, one of the first things I'll be doing, Tom, is getting that new head of, Sam will be getting that new head of, to ensure that we properly assess the priorities and where we can most get some early income streams coming in, but also what the strategic approach is. We've had some sort of buds, if you like, some shoots of opportunities that have emerged so far, and we'll continue to explore those even in advance of her arrival.
Okay, that's good. I was looking at the list of countries and metro systems that RATP, the Paris Metro operates in. There's a huge long list.
Absolutely.
And so clearly great potential there, and including, I think, several in this country.
I wouldn't like to comment.
But I want to turn now to bus services. And the first question is, when do you think why do you think that bus passengers will increase while you're reducing services, I think, by 7% across the business plan?
So let me just try and give you a bit of context in this, and I promise you I will get to answer the question. So bus services are actually now the most reliable they've ever been in this city. So that's based on bus speeds, on journey times. So bus speeds have stabilised, and actually they're now improving in parts of London. That's partly because we've been ensuring we properly consider bus prioritisation as part of work we do on cycling, part of the work that we do more broadly on redoing critical junctions and everything else. So bus prioritisation is a key part of what we do. 120 bus priority schemes indeed have been introduced. So that means that some of the additional buses that we had added into the schedule, which were in effect there to cater for the unreliability of the service, the sort of bunching of the service, the fact that you could wait 30 seconds or 20 minutes in extremis for buses on particular lines of route. Kingsway in Holborn has 100 buses per hour going up it. I can tell you that buses cause congestion for buses on that route. And therefore, by reducing the number of buses you're running up that line of route, you actually improve reliability hugely in the outer parts of the city where those bus routes inevitably ultimately serve, either on the way in or the way out. And that, I think, is a really important point to emphasise. So when we look at growing bus routes in outer London in places like Thamesmead, Lower Lee Valley, Wembley, Old Oak Common, Acton, Barking, Riverside, Wandsworth, Riverside, Hillingdon, Colindale, and so many other places, that is precisely why we can do so, because we've managed to take away that capacity that we just threw in to deal with an increasingly infrequent service because of bunching and buses getting caught up in congestion. So this is a strange science, number of buses per hour and everything else. But actually, if I just take you to sort of other parts of the transport network, if you're running a train service, actually, the key thing is having balanced headways, gaps between trains being properly managed so that you are able to optimise the number of people per vehicle that you can carry. The same principle is precisely true of buses. So if I look at where we have reduced the bus service by some 40% along Oxford Street, hopefully in advance of the work that we're going to be doing in pedestrianisation, that actually has not had a negative impact in the number of people we'll be able to carry or in the usage of buses along that line of route. So this is it's a challenge, and we've got to look at every route and every part of the city individually to make sure we get this right. But that's why the numbers come out as they do. So kilometrage is probably not the best figure to look at. It is about how many people we can move on the buses. And there is no doubt that given the objectives in the Mayor's transport strategy that we have to move more, and that's why we're configuring the bus network to be just that.
But where the bus kilometrage is important, as you sort of alluded to by talking about the fact, Kingsway and Oxford Street are getting crowded. I think, I would agree that it's sensible to try and optimise that and ensure you're not creating congestion. But you talk about increasing services out of London. Why then have I and other Assembly members had complaints from many people? I presented a petition to the Assembly very recently about cuts to the W12 in Wanstead. That's an out of London. Yeah. I've had complaints anecdotally from all around areas of outer London where people have had their bus services cut. completely get why you want to reduce congestion in Oxford Street and around these other areas, but why then aren't we seeing this increase in outer London? And can you quantify what's happening in outer London for us?
Yes. I mean, I think just for, again, I alluded to some examples of where we are increasing some bus services in outer London. Now, of course, I'm very well aware, because I see the correspondence and I'm party to some of the questions that you get asked, and I get asked them directly, as you will imagine. And I think, I have a very detailed list of, for example, the changes that we're doing in the next couple of months and the reason that we're doing them. So, some on some it's some very minimal changes. We're reducing services to run, for example, on the 92, reducing it from every 9 minutes to every 8 minutes. That actually, the experience of from run every 9 minutes, 9 minutes instead of 8. I do apologise. 9 minutes instead of 8. Now, actually, the evidence of that is that small tweak in this situation has made a huge difference in terms of the reliability of the service. Now, there are other routes that we have to continue to review, and we've committed to, the W12 is a good example, we've committed to continue to look at that to see that it is fit for purpose, that when people turn up at a bus stop, that they get the bus that they expect to get, then it's reliably there. Whereas actually previously with some of these routes, that simply hasn't been the case. The bus service hasn't operated as it should do and as it's planned to do so, and has had, in some cases, significant supply of capacity that hasn't ever been taken up, despite our original assertion when we put the bus route in.
But from our point of view, I mean, the Mayor, you and the Mayor, and I've questioned the Mayor about this several times, and I still don't actually feel any more enlightened, actually, I have to say about this. You talk about increasing bus kilometrage or improving the bus service in outer London. Unless we can see it quantified, we can't tell whether it's happening, and we can't then say to our constituents when they complain about it, well, actually, no, actually, if you look at it, we're actually seeing an improvement. So what we need from you is if you can set out exactly how much it is increasing, or what is happening to the level of the service in outer London, so that we can actually hold you and the Mayor to account about it.
I absolutely understand that. And I think that is work in progress at the moment. We're doing just that. So I can't give you all the exact figures right now. We are working this through. I have, as you will know, got quite a new team looking at the bus service. I mean, one of the reasons that we've been able to break through some of the historical way we've run the bus service in London is because I have brought in some new, fresh thinking to this dynamic. I know that Gareth Powley, who runs Surface Transport, has met with some of you, and I know that he and his team would be more than happy to meet with any of you to go through this in detail, or indeed, Chair, if it would be helpful to go through a wider discussion with the committee at some point on this. I'd half hoped to bring Gareth with me this morning, but I understand you want to keep this a fairly low number of attendees from our side, which is absolutely fine. But I just think that might be almost worthy of a separate session in its own behalf, because I think there's a really exciting story to tell on buses. But you're quite right, you need to know the numbers. I need to convince you that the credibility of the Mayor's transport strategy, going back to the Deputy Chair's question earlier on, the credibility of that strategy is exemplified by real increase in kilometres in certain parts of outer London. I can use specific examples of Thamesmead, I can use specific examples of where, before you get rail capacity, that you use buses to grow, mark in those places. I visit outer London boroughs alongside all other boroughs in London on a regular basis, and I have very specific conversations with them about the requirements that they have, and again to emphasise the point about how the strategy needs to be credible going forward. So more than happy to share that detail as it continues to emerge. It's a very well made point.
Thank you, and I think we need that, because I do sometimes feel like we're sort of fishing around in the dark when it comes to this. I've got a couple more questions on buses, but were there members that wanted to come in, specifically on the bus kilometrage?
On this one, if I can.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
And that is, I think Tom's quite right. If I look at my local bus route, the 329, you are planning to reduce it. It is just by that 1 or 2 minutes. I'm only at off-peak. But to local people, it does seem as if their buses are being cut.
Yeah.
But I'm understanding what you're saying. And the danger that we see as well is that because lots of journeys in outer London are done by car, and they may only be 10-minute journeys, but if they then have to wait for a bus that's almost 10 minutes, why not just get into your car? And I understand that, because I've been in contact with TfL about some night buses and how you calculate how many buses you need. And on that, it's you take the demand at the busiest stop and then work out capacity. Well, if that's the case, what you might find that when you lengthen those waits, that people the demand is less because people are returning to the cars. Then you're into a spiral that because demand's going down, that the bus service isn't needed, therefore we'll take even more out. And it's how you counter that, and you look beyond just passenger numbers, because the falling passenger numbers might mean that actually the demand's still there, it's just that the timings are not right.
I couldn't have put it more eloquently myself. You're absolutely right. It's precisely striking that balance. So you are correct, of course, in saying that you can't get to a situation where, and the last thing we certainly want to do is get to a situation where people consider that travelling by private car for those short distance journeys in outer London is a more viable option than using a regular, frequent, high capacity bus service. So I absolutely get that, and that sweet spot is a very important place to get to in all of these routes, and that's why we do go through this in a very detailed way. You know, we brought together, again for the first time as part of our transformation and modernisation programme, we brought together the rail planning team with a bus planning team. We brought together that type of discipline of thought to ensure that we get this right and that we absolutely review where we think we've got things wrong. And I can absolutely assure you, and indeed the rest of the members round the committee, that actually if we've got this wrong in places, then we'll put bus service back in. I'm not, this is not some sort of diktat from me or draconian process that we're applying ruthlessly without consideration of the local needs of local people in local communities across the city. We will absolutely respond to that. As I say, I do think in the generality and in some of the specifics it'd be useful to have Gareth with some of his team here taking you through this, but the way you describe it is quite right. The last thing we want to do is put people back in their cars.
Well, I think we'd welcome that meeting with Gareth and Co.
I'll just come back on to some other questions. That's the final couple. Will TfL be introducing more express routes? Where will they be and when?
Yes, we are considering more express routes. I can give you a couple of examples. I mean, these are not fully confirmed yet, so please bear with me. But we're looking at an X140 express route from Harrow to Heathrow, for example, likely next year sometime. Actually, we're also considering some new feeder routes into the Elizabeth line as well, down Bexley Heath Woolwich via Abbey Wood. That may not be, some of it may be express.
Woolwich, Abbey Wood, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a whole range of ones that we're considering. Those are the ones I've got the most detail with to hand, Tom, right now. But there certainly is something that we've seen where we've had some of these introduced. It's been very successful. And of course, it also gives the opportunity, as we've tried on some routes already, to brand the bus with the, you keep that bus on that line of route, and you actually, it makes it much simpler for people. They can see this is a particular route, and because it's outside the bus as well, and they're very familiar with the reliability and the journey time it takes you from point to point. So yeah, it's a really important consideration.
And do you think, not that I want to suggest that we don't need or shouldn't have the Sutton Tram extension, for example, it's very important, but could you be, in the meantime, I would never say such a thing to me. We would never. But in the meantime, are there potentially places where you could operate an express routes?
There are, and I think that's something we continue to explore, and certainly in advance of some of those areas. So I mentioned Thamesmead, for example, where in advance of rail links being provided. I think this is a really good start-up in terms of encouraging the use of public transport in a credible way prior to getting an effective rail link in place. So absolutely, the principle is a very good one.
And finally, when will the review of bus driver working conditions be commissioned, as the Mayor has pledged? And that was in response to one of our recommendations in our report.
So we have been looking at a number of things in parallel with our bus safety programme, and in terms of looking at the working conditions of our bus drivers. Clearly all bus drivers have gone through training in the Hello London programme, as it's called, all the bus drivers across London in a joint programme. I'm delighted that the Mayor gave us an extra £6 million not so long ago, just a few weeks ago, to ensure that we can expedite the provision of decent toilet facilities on
Very
all
important.
routes much more quickly than we would have done. We would have done it anyway, but this just gives us an opportunity to deliver that more quickly, and the detailed plan of that is just being churned through right now to ensure that happens. And we work regularly with Unite the Union and others who have an interest in this area. And for the avoidance of doubt, bus drivers are hugely important to us, is what they do. I was up at Wilson Bus Garage just a few weeks ago, meeting with some of them and the management team up there to ensure that we hear firsthand what the challenges are for bus drivers. So we're working this through. There's an overall plan of activity which again we can share with you. I mean, things like the driver passport that allows people to move without having to reapply to individual companies where they move around. I think we're making great progress. You never do these things quite as fast as you might wish, but definitely real progress.
But the Mayor did promise I think a full review. Do you know when that's going to happen?
I don't know off the top of my head for that, Tom, but again I can come back to you with any detail. Yeah.
Just a quick one finally on the bus driver toilets, which I really welcome. I think it's incredibly important. There's also an issue, of course, with taxi drivers. I mean, are they going to be available to taxi drivers as well?
We can consider that. I honestly don't know, but that's a very good thought.
Excellent.
Yeah, thank you.
Very good. I've got Joanne.
Last July, the Mayor issued a press release about following the review of bus routes to hospitals. And you were hoping to make improvements to 40 routes, I think, were looked at. But you had 7 priority routes, which the press release said you hoped to deliver in the next year. And one of those was a bus route from my constituency that I've been lobbying for about 4 years now, to the North Middlesex Hospital from Enfield Town through Winchmere Hill to the North Middlesex. And I've followed this up on a regular basis since. And the Mayor's questions from this last month states that the route is subject to funding and consultation, and TfL will work with the London Borough of Enfield to identify external sources of funding. And that will gave me a bit concerned that it's still in the future and it's not being worked upon at the moment. Could you, whether today or in writing, just give me a proper update as to where we are with that route to the North Middlesex Hospital? Because the reconfiguration of hospitals in my area has posed some real issues.
I'm aware of the specific issue. I do believe actually that it doesn't give the right sense of the degree of urgency we're dealing with this, but I will give you a more full answer, if I may, back in writing, just to make sure that you get that. I'll make sure you get that, as soon as you can in the next few days, because it is an important issue. And again, for the avoidance of doubt, this is an area where buses play a huge role in ensuring that often quite vulnerable people, by definition, who need to access hospital either to visit loved ones or for their own appointments or their own treatments in hospital require such services. So I will get back to you in the detail of where we are, but I think we're making more progress than perhaps that answer might have implied.
Be helpful, because I visited a sheltered accommodation along that, what would be that route, only a couple of weeks ago, and residents were really looking forward to be able to actually have a direct route to hospital.
Well, I'll certainly follow up as quickly as I can.
Thank you.
Caroline.
Could I just ask, one of the key things you want to do is to get more passengers onto buses. So how are you looking at marketing the buses and potentially, we've got a lot of tourists coming to London. Is there a way you could sort of promote certain routes as a good way to see sites on a ticket, and maybe even work with developers to have an app which, when you get to St Paul's, press 1 and you can listen to a bit of tourist info. So actually trying to sell a service as well as a passenger route, as it were.
I think it's a great idea. I think we should hire you, Caroline. I think honestly, I think that's a really good idea. I'm not sure we thought about that. Somebody in the team may have thought about that specifically. I think in the broader context of marketing, though, you are quite right. And that's why I kind of alluded to the branding of individual routes as well, because that is part of all of that as well. I think that although apps have developed hugely in recent years, there are still some people in the city who aren't as confident as they might be about using an unfamiliar bus route. So they may use one or two that they're accustomed to in their own local area or in parts of central London that they use as part of their getting around the city, but not necessarily if they happen to be in a different part of the city for whatever reason, that the confidence isn't always there. So I think we continue to work with app developers on seeing what more we can do. And I think the kind of thing of having information on some of the access to what buses are available in and around bus stops, which of course is a hugely useful physical asset that you can apply there, and indeed, very importantly, in tube stations and other places where people arrive at, you know, potentially then moving to a bus for the next part of their journey. So I think it's a really good point, and I think in both we should just have a further review to see what more we can do. But I do know that we're, you know, generally we're trying to encourage people on public transport by just getting people more familiar with the lines of route. So
overseas tourism is booming.
Yeah, absolutely, it is.
Actually, if you know when you're coming,
Yeah.
that or at the tourist information centres you've got around key stations, that actually here's something which shows you an app you could download and potentially get income from that, but also go on the number 11 route and you get to see these key things. Go on this route. You know, that would get more people onto the buses as well, rather than perhaps other modes.
I think that's good, and I think certainly you're right. Our visitor information centres at the key hub stations do a lot of really good work. You know, many of the staff there are multilingual and do a great amount of work. So, for example, if you arrive at St Pancras or wherever, and you get access to that information. But I'm sure there's more we can do, and it's certainly a well-made point. Thank you.
Okay, quickie from me, a couple actually. I went to Abellio bus depot yesterday in Battersea. Yes, I did get there. I think I was the only member who did. To look at their mobile trial that they're doing. I believe you've given them quite a substantial grant out of the Innovation Fund to do that. Are you monitoring the progress of that?
We are. I mean, we're looking at all sorts of innovation in terms of you know, general trials that we've got out there. I mean, some of the other stuff on bus safety in terms of intelligent speed assistance, all sorts of other things that actually, as technology moves forward, you know, we continue to work with the bus operators on all this. I would say actually that I think there's been a real step change in our relationship with bus operators in the last year or so, where we're actually you know, we had our first bus safety summit, for example, not so long ago. And I think, if I'm being honest, some of the chief execs of the owning bus companies didn't necessarily understand the imperative of working together on some of these key strategic issues, and I think they do so much more now. So I'm very pleased that in all counts we're working much more collaboratively with bus operators.
What I saw was very, very impressive figures in the reduction of collisions.
Yes.
Going virtually from 2 or 3 a week down to 0.
Yeah.
Which must make a substantial saving, and the kit itself is relatively inexpensive.
Yeah.
Can you give us an assurance that, an assurance that, you may want to try it a bit more, but that these kits or something similar can be fitted to all buses if that kind of return is achieved?
Well, absolutely, I can give you that assurance. I think the trick is on this that we do the right analysis of the data. So, you know, you've got some headline figures. You're ahead of me, I have to say, in knowing that, but I will certainly follow up to look at the detail of that a particular statistic. But I think it's really important that we have the right level of assurance, of course, so that we don't unwittingly import some unintended consequence of new technology for you know, distraction or other sort of issues that might emerge. But a bit like, you know, we applied some technology in the aftermath of the terrible tram incident at Sandylands. We had to do a bit of considered assessment of what was right. We had to be very, very clear, as we were, of course, that this was nothing to do with questioning the competency of individual operators. It was about proper alerting systems and ensuring that there was an additional tool, if you like, to assist the operation. So I think, you know, with that slight caveat, just to make sure we properly validate these things, absolutely, we shouldn't hold back on this stuff. There is nothing more important to me. For the avoidance of doubt, every single incident that either applies to a passenger on a bus or somebody who is in collision with a bus is just one too many. And if we're to be serious about Vision Zero, and by the way, I am absolutely committed to it, then we really have to move apace on this, so we will.
That's helpful, thank you. Something I mentioned to you a while ago, and you sort of showed some interest. At the moment, as you know, uniquely, TfL demand that the buses have blinds on the destination. most other companies, or virtually every other company across the world, use digital signs. Where are you with that?
I think, as I said to you last time, which wasn't so long ago, I think I did say to you that we were exploring how that looks and how that appears, particularly for those with, that digital signs appear for those with potentially some visual impairments, so that we have a consistency and clarity of signage in the front of buses. As I think I said to you last time, Chair, that we now have, we think we've almost got an exact replica of what a manual sign, if I can use that term, looks like in digital format, and it looks really promising. So I have seen it. I think it's really exciting. We haven't got towards the implementation of these yet, but I think we're, as I said to you last time, we're on the cusp. I think we're even nearer to being on the cusp.
But will that, again, be something unique to TfL as opposed to something that's an industry standard?
Well, no, I think it could be an industry standard. I think, though, what we've tended to see across the country in other operators, and you will all be familiar with visiting other cities, is that you tend to see these sort of, what you might describe as dot matrix type signage, which, you know, is the original stuff we had on tube stations, for example, which, or indeed in some of the countdown signage we had on bus stops previously. And some of that is fine, but some of it actually does, for particular visual impairments, cause some difficulties. And I think we just have to be very clear that we're doing something that has no, no reduction in people's ability to properly find their way around our network. So it's really important to me that we have that validation.
Any timelines?
No, I don't have off the top of my head. No, I don't.
Okay. All right. Cool. Thank you very much. Thank you. So we now move on to. We'll now move on to Caroline Russell.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to be asking you about walking, cycling, healthy streets type stuff. I mean, first of all, it's very good to see in the latest version that the first policy is still to reduce car dependency, and also that the second policy is that people are encouraged, I think it says, to walk and cycle. It'd be good if they were enabled to walk and cycle. Just before I get into some of the detail, just one disappointment, given the focus on traffic reduction and getting as many journeys done by public transport, walking and cycling. The road crossings in East London are still in here, and they are road crossings rather than public transport, walking and cycling crossings. So I wondered if you could comment on that, and in particular on Silvertown Tunnel, which, in terms of air pollution, that, the latest air pollution figures show that it is still going to be a problem in terms of air pollution. So why that sort of sits out like a bit of a sore thumb really in the strategy, when there's so much in there that's about reducing traffic and really working in a very focused way to get to that target for 2041 of 80% journeys.
Well, Silvertown is a public transport crossing in that it will enable 36 buses an hour to cross through it, full-size double-deck buses, clean modern double-deck buses to go through that very important strategic link across the river in that part of London. At the moment, the Blackwall Tunnel allows at best 6 single-deck buses an hour to go through because of its capacity constraints. So the fact that we'll have a dedicated bus lane in the Silvertown crossing, encouraging people to use public transport crossing through the tunnel. We were considering how we might ensure the provision for cycles to be carried on buses through the tunnel, how we might look at short hop journeys for pedestrians through the tunnel on buses as well. So actually I think it is a very important addition to our public transport network in establishing...
It's still going to have cars going through
well,
it?
Well, it will have cars going through it, but actually...
Have you thought about just making it buses, walking and cycling so that you are not inducing more car traffic demand in that sort of area that is currently very polluted?
Well, we have looked at that, and as you know, in advance of the development consent order, the government did call this in again and ask us to have a further look at the air quality assessment around this, which we've been doing in partnership with them, and our assessment is that this is still the right thing to do in terms of easing actually some congestion of traffic in other parts of London, particularly in the Blackwall Tunnel itself, where you can get some significant queues of sometimes idling vehicles, polluting idling vehicles, and actually this is a link through. But I do really want to emphasise, Colin, I know that you and I perhaps will never see total eye to eye, but I do think that we should at least collectively rejoice on the public transport provision that is provided through here. This is a real opportunity to transform journeys for hundreds of thousands of people in that part of the city, from cars to buses to public transport, in a way that they've never had the opportunity before.
And what I would hope is that we don't undermine that by making it easy for them. As Joanne says, you know, if it's easy to get in your car, particularly in outer London, you will get in your car. So by providing the extra car lanes through a tunnel, one is also inducing extra car traffic. But we're not going to agree, so let's move on. Really fantastic to see your commitment to Vision Zero. And I just want to relate that back to the relationship with buses, because healthy streets, you are saying, is about walking, cycling and public transport. What I and residents are beginning to find is that some TfL officers out, you know, looking at, shall we put in a new crossing here, bus journey time reliability is being used as a reason why some things to help pedestrians and cyclists are being refused. And so the question for you is, how do you prioritise between bus journey time reliability and the needs of people who want to walk and ride their bikes?
Well, I think the first thing to say is, just from a sort of management perspective, this is all controlled now in the same team again, where this never was before. So this was the whole issue of looking at healthy streets is now in one portfolio, one programme. I really welcome and value the oversight that Will Norman, the Walking and Cycling Commissioner, gives me in this area, because he is not only committed to walking and cycling, hugely committed, as you know, because you will have met him several times, but he also recognises the importance of buses in the city. Indeed, buses in contributing to more journeys by walking and cycling, because as we know, that's a key factor. So I think there will occasionally be tensions as to how this is resolved. I'm disappointed to hear that sometimes people are using bus speeds as a kind of reason for not providing decent pedestrian or indeed cycling provision at various locations. But I think we will continue to try and get better at this. I mean, I can't sit here and pretend we're perfect at this yet. But the infrastructure, the governance infrastructure, rather dull term, is, I think, in place now to make sure that we continue to improve in this area. And certainly, if there are areas where you think we get it wrong, you will continue to challenge us, and we'll continue to have a proper look at it through Will and through the team.
That's great. I think the danger is that that bus journey time reliability could become the new smoothing the flow, i.e. something that just shifts the priority away from people. You know, the people who are walking and cycling should be getting sort of first dibs in terms of road space and capacity, and then absolutely the buses come next before the cars, the freight and everything else.
Absolutely agree with you.
But it's just making sure that everyone, that filters throughout the organisation as a thing.
I agree, and I'll assure you that both Will and myself are diligent in our pursuit of every last dark area of the organisation that might not have got this yet.
Excellent. Then on to the sort of actual cycling. The Mayor pledged he was going to triple the current cycle superhighway provision from 12 kilometres to 36 kilometres. And if the 6 new routes that were identified, kind of using the TfL strategic cycling analysis, if those are all delivered, then he could meet that pledge to triple the numbers. However, there's nothing in here that actually says what, it doesn't talk about quiet ways, cycle superhighways. Is that so the standard for how this cycle provision is going to be built, is there sort of clarity about what
Well, I think obviously, as you know, there's a sort of hierarchy of types of cycle provision that we require. I mean, the first thing to say is, and I do appreciate you acknowledging it, that 2.2 billion being spent with, 600 million on cycle routes, including so-called superhighways and quiet ways, is really quite significant. Another 600 in borough schemes, another 600 in healthy streets on the TLRN, with some other work on air quality and bus priority. So that's quite a significant amount of money. I think it is. I think there's a bit of a definitional thing here, because I think we recognise that all cycling provision plays a part, and of course it will be different in different parts of London as to what you can physically do, whether it's a dedicated segregated cycleway or whether it's a quiet way or mini Holland indeed that actually gives you a sort of...
Keith and I went to visit Mini Holland earlier. Was it earlier this week?
Yeah,
it was indeed. It was first day of snow. And it was really inspiring. An 8-year-old could have cycled with us. And what they had done was not hugely expensive either. It was quite ordinary things, filtering to prevent rat running traffic, and quite simple cycle tracks, but really made a difference to how it felt cycling around.
It really does, and I think that's why it's a combination of both. So I think the work certainly on Cycle Super Highway 3, so-called, which opened in December, as you know. Then there's 4, 6, phase 2 of 6, 9, 10, 11, and where we get to with that. Then there's the work on the quiet ways, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 11, 13, 14, 15, he says, reeling it off quite quickly. But those are already open, with 36 routes currently planned in total. Actually, we've got construction underway on 16 quiet way routes, and so there'll be an additional 100 kilometres by the end of the year, which is really quite significant. I think it's about the right hierarchy for these, but I wouldn't want to give the sense in any way that we are taking our foot off the absolute gold standard of a segregated cycleway, and particularly, and this is why I'm so unapologetic for anyone who ever criticises on this, if we avoid one single person being killed or seriously injured because we have put in a cycle superhighway, then that is worth it, in my judgment. It's absolutely worth it. And I think, therefore, that's why doing this in the right balanced way, whether it's quiet ways, whether it's dedicated cycleways. By the way, I don't like the term cycle superhighway, because I think
I agree with you there,
I think it implies something a bit motorway-like, and actually what I want to do is ensure that we are, and I know Will is very keen on this as well, that we encourage all sorts of people from all parts of London's community to feel comfortable. And you mentioned an 8-year-old. Well, I want people to feel comfortable through all the generations and through all the demographies of London to be able to feel comfortable in cycling around our great city.
So maybe we need a naming competition or something because but the gold standard is what is absolutely important, because when we also visited did a tour around some of the quiet ways recently, and we could not have had an 8-year-old cycling with us because there were delivery vehicles that were stopping across the route, which meant that we had to pull out into heavy traffic, or what we actually did was get off and push our bikes along the pavement. That's not cycling provision, and it really needs to be much better than that, particularly when you've got planned things. There was a BBC Symphony Orchestra massive truck blocking the route by the Barbican. That should be planned and anticipated. That's not a surprise. And if the quiet ways can evolve into something that becomes a bit of a better gold standard, that's going to need a real emphasis on looking at how deliveries and freight happens along those routes if we're going to feel okay about our 8-year-olds.
I absolutely agree, and it's a very, to use those sort of real examples is really, is really clear, and I agree with you, yeah.
And then I've got one final question, which is actually I've got two, sorry. Given TfL's financial position, how confident are you that the planned spending on cycling that's in the current TfL business plan will all go ahead?
It's budgeted, it's there for provision.
It's fully funded.
Yeah. Okay. So yes, we're very confident. This is an absolute priority. So when the finance guy says it's fully funded, he means he's going to deliver it.
Okay, well, we will all take a note of that. We will hold you to that one. And then finally, really good to see CS9 going ahead. Yep. It's the issue of consultation and working with communities is obviously really important. Now, people in Islington will not forgive me if I don't ask about Hybrid Corner, which was meant to have been the results of the consultation which happened back in 2015. They were going to be fully announced before Christmas, then it was January, now it's February, February's gone, it's March. Is this delay because there's been so much difficulty with some schemes that involve walking and cycling? And do you have thoughts about how you think it is best to engage with communities so that people can feed in constructive thoughts into plans?
Well, I think we can always do better. I mean, we have, you know, again, part of our transformation in the organisation been sort of reviewing the whole way that we engage with local communities, boroughs and more generally local communities on this and every other subject. I would say Hybrid Corner is in the budget specifically as a named item, so we're you know, very confident we will do the work on Hybrid Corner. And you're quite right on CS9. The consultation finished, I think, some 60%. The latest figures I had were supportive of the scheme, but you know, I think it is a well-made point. These are sometimes controversial schemes, and we need to make sure that we get the great mobilisation of the community behind us as we do these things. Because, and again, I think that goes back to some of the terminology that we use. Because if people consider these are motorways of cycling, that is one more potential impediment to them wanting to walk, then that is clearly not an objective that we want to see fulfilled. So I think we could always do better, but certainly we're intending to proceed.
Okay, so you're intending to proceed, but in terms of the local people being able to feed in to the more finalised designs.
I'll take that away certainly and just see what we do. Yeah, that's
Thank
a
you
good
very
point.
much.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Mike, comes to me now on future transport. Do you have a view on how the use of drones should be controlled in London?
Well, so we successfully led a bid to something called the National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts, NESTA, to become a partner city in their Flying High programme, which focuses on drones. Now this programme, which is funded by Innovate UK, is investigating if and how drones could be introduced into the urban areas to the public's benefit. We're working with the GLA, and of course we have to work, Chair, as you'll understand, with London's emergency services, with London councils, with other public sector stakeholders and universities to see how this might move forward. And to that end, we're seeking to conduct stakeholder and public engagement discussions in May of this year. So we've got some discussion that we'll be having at that time, and that will lead then Nesta to publish a vision for drones in London, we think, with a strategy for safely unlocking any of those benefits just after that, but probably in June this year. But you know, there are huge issues for me around this that we just need to be very cognizant of. So obviously there's the pretty clear safety issue that you would have to consider. There's noise. There's legal hurdles around sort of aviation and overbuilt up areas. There's the looking and seeing how public acceptance might work or might not work before I think any commercial use would be seen to be acceptable. So I want to understand the risks. I want to understand the concerns. I don't want to be seen as being resistant to this, but I do think it's really important that when you're going into something so different from what we've seen before, that we're very cognizant of all the issues that are there, and that we deal with them sensibly and in a structured way.
I've been informed that drones actually cover both air and surface vehicles. I always thought there was drones and droids, but apparently not. There are companies operating drones, droids, as we speak, on pavements and roads in London. Are you engaging with them? How is that being
I'm not aware that we are, but certainly that's something that I would want to look at as part of this overall approach, just because there are some definitional issues, as you imply, actually, about what, things that are sort of broadly hovering just above the surface have clearly got quite a different issue that you face compared to ones that are actually above head height.
Are you having any discussions with government on possible need for legislation, or?
Well, not so much with government that I'm aware of. We have had some outline discussion with the European Commission on this, where just so they're aware of the sort of things that we're looking at, because clearly when you do this from a more than one country perspective, it's usually quite useful.
Okay. I'm just worried that we're not really getting ahead of the curve on this. So, but I'll leave it at that, because clearly you are doing some work, but we have had examples, haven't we, in the past where people have just moved in because there is this vacuum in relation to legislation or regulation or even MOUs, and I just feel that there, as I say, it worries me that there is a company currently using droids in a couple of the boroughs, 3 I think boroughs in London, but that you're not engaging with them, or that you're not actually working with them.
Well, I'll take that away and have a look at the specifics. I mean, perhaps if you were able to share the detail of the specifics, that'd be very helpful.
I won't advertise anyone today, but
happily do that. I think, as I say, there's the difference between, for example, dockless bike hires, which you might be alluding to when you say that other
we're coming to that in a minute, Doc.
Okay, sorry, but I think the difference here is that, in a sense, there is already a regulatory framework that applies for drones flying above head height, which is that there are huge restrictions on that being able to be done, which is why I think it's important that we're in at the outset, and that's why we did bid for this partnership arrangement to get some funding to allow us to have this discussion in May this year. So I think that will help inform us further. So I'd like to think we are, if not absolutely at the forefront, quite near it.
Okay. Sean, you want to come in on this point?
I'm slightly more encouraged by the fact that you bid for this money and you're looking at it, but how wide-ranging is this piece of work? Because there is a great difference between a wheeled droid on the pavement, one flying above our heads. Obviously in London we have lots of tall buildings that block signals, so could affect autonomy. And obviously London will be a big marketplace for anything. If we are leading on this, then we'd be able to set some of the rules to suit us and then not constantly be chasing it, because we're in a very different environment to everybody else. How detailed is this work?
I think that will depend on the discussion that we have leading up to May. So as I say, just to be very clear, this is not just us, because this clearly goes way beyond the remit of just Transport for London. That's why working with the GLA, working with all the emergency services in London, so the fire, police, ambulance service and everybody else, is really important. Working with London councils, of course, because there will be specific concerns and issues that they will raise from local communities. Other public sector organisations, utility companies, others will be hugely interested, and I'm sure having a dialogue on this as well as those with a sort of academic input into this, so universities, technology colleges, others who actually are spend a lot of time thinking about this. I think I'm pretty confident we'll be as wide-ranging as we need to be. I mean, you never have perfect foresight as to what sort of technology is emerging. But I think it's important that it's not limiting, which I think is the substance of your point.
And can we, at least for us and TfL, I understand how some of the other stakeholders may have a different view to this, can we start to build a standard for London? Because a lot of these companies involved will have a vision about their product and what they want to achieve. I think we need to have an idea of what we want to achieve in London, what can happen.
I think yes, we should do, but I think we do need to get through this sort of dialogue first. But I think so. There's a bit of a phasing thing here.
This is a plea as much as anything else to make sure that we don't get subsumed in whatever lovely outcome they're looking for. We get a specific outcome for London.
No, I hear you very clearly. It's a well-made point. Thank you.
Good.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Right, so moving on to dockless bikes, if I may. Now, they are starting to roll out through the different boroughs. In fact, tomorrow, 2 launch in one of my boroughs, Redbridge. We saw one in Waltham Forest, very good. But it's just, my worry with this is that, unlike the Boris bikes, where you can travel between one borough and another as long as they've got one. Another bone of contention, but with these, if I was to cycle from, say, Havering to here, I might have to change bikes 5 times in order to, and also have to get off the bike on the borough boundary, then cross the borough boundary by foot and get another bike the other side of the borough boundary. Is there any way that TfL could take a strategic role here and work with the boroughs to have some, I don't know whether it's going to be a framework agreement or some kind of borough-wide licensing scheme, so that there is, we become joined up rather than fragmented?
I think it's a well-made point, and I'm smiling to myself actually, because it was, again, this is a conversation I was having at the Transport Environment Committee with the boroughs last week, was on this very subject, about the challenge as these schemes extend, about how you deal with cross-borough boundary issues and how you ensure this is easy for individual cyclists, because again, this is something that you don't want to deter people because of the mechanics of having to change from one provider to another at a borough boundary. You don't want to deter people who might otherwise be new to cycling and be looking at this as an opportunity. So, because this makes cycling more accessible to many more Londoners, I think it's vital that we are introduced in a way that suits our capital and suits that reality. So, I think we haven't quite got all the answers to this yet, but but you're quite right, as this extends. I mean, I too saw the scheme in Waltham Forest, which I was very encouraged by. Ealing's been doing some good stuff, as you say, Redbridge introducing it as well. So I think as these increasingly emerge, we've now got this code of practice, as you know, in place to ensure compliance from the operators, which is a really important part of this. But I think as it extends more globally, we need to deal with exactly as you're saying, and look at how the recirculating of bikes can happen as naturally as possible. Because one of the reasons it's Tom's name's fallen off. One of the reasons that the Santander cycle scheme has been so effective is because it does allow that flexibility for people to move around the place. So it's a very good point. Will Norman is, I know, working on this as we speak, and I'm sure he'll be able to update you in due course.
Right, lovely, okay. Is there any sort of chance that TfL themselves could make spaces available for doctors?
Yeah, maybe so. I think going forward, I think as technology evolves, the Santander scheme has been a fantastic sort of, if you like, exemplar of beginning to get people to use to the prospect of hiring bikes in the city. But as technology moves on, I'm sure there are things that we can collaborate with the operators on more on going forward. So yeah, we're always up for that thought.
Thank you. Can I move on to demand responsive buses?
Yeah,
please. I think you probably agree that there's a sort of a regulatory grey area around these vehicles. Are you going to be able to do anything to solve that issue of the greyness? And are you concerned about them eating into your fare revenue? Because there is a danger, isn't there, I would say, that they would just cherry pick the most lucrative routes, for instance?
Yeah, I think so. The answer to both questions is yes. We do have to be very cognizant of them. We have to be, work insofar as we can with the providers here, because sometimes, of course, they will fulfil a very important role where perhaps there isn't sufficient demand for a viable bus route to be provided. These are smaller vehicles and often can provide a particular role in a demand responsive way for particular times of the day or for particular communities wishing to be served. So I think we need to work with the providers, and we've done some work recently to look at just that. But you are quite right. I mean, this is something that blurs the boundaries, in a sense, doesn't it, between private transport and public transport. And therefore it's a new phenomenon. And the important thing for me is that we work with those who are seeking to come to London. And by the way, nearly everybody wants to play in London. If they want to play anywhere in the world, they want to play in London, because London is what it is. So how do we work with them? How do we ensure we don't undermine the viability and operability of our core public transport provision? But how do we ensure where there is a need that we facilitate it from our role from our role as regulator and allower of such things. So I think, you know, it's a finely balanced initiative, and we've been working this through in the last few months.
Have you made any contact with government in relation to possible additional legislation? Or?
No, I mean, I think the problem is, Chair, as you know, at the moment, any prospect of legislation is very limited. So we almost try to do everything out with that, first of all. So I don't think we've got to a point where we see legislation as being the ultimate answer here. I think what we see at the moment is a collaborative approach with prospective operators to work out what we can do together.
Okay. In 2014, Boris promised that TfL would never buy another tube train without driverless capability. Now, I'm not advocating that all the trains become driverless, but what I'm asking you now is, when this question was asked of the current mayor, he sort of expressed some opposition to driverless trains. Can I get an assurance from you that whilst you may not introduce driverless trains, any new rolling stock will have driverless capacity or capability?
I think all new rolling stock has the provision for a huge degree of automation. So even the trains that we've got on the Victoria line, for example, where we run very effectively and very safely, including this morning, I just checked before I came in, 36 trains an hour in each direction in the morning and evening peak. Those trains are in effect driven automatically. The driver fulfills the function of checking the platform and very critical safety function and opening and closing the doors. I think I've been consistent, and I've said it on record in the previous mayoral administration, and I've said it here, that actually, if I look at a line like the Piccadilly line, it is unimaginable to me that we wouldn't have a member of London Underground staff on the train. I lived through the horror of the bombings of 7th of July 2005. I went to site immediately after that terrible event. It's not a day I would ever seek to relive, I will tell you. I'm sure you will understand why. And actually one of the things that was extraordinarily helpful was having one of our highly fantastic professional train staff on the train to do what he was able to do with the people affected. So people often say London Underground should never say they're unique. Well, actually they are unique in one context, and that is that unlike any other metro in the world, we have single bore, deep level tube tunnels very deep below our city. No other metro quite has that. Paris is not very deep, and they're connected. They're cut and cover design rather than bored tunnels. And other metros that have deep tube lines as such tend to have one tunnel where the trains run alongside each other. London is different. So I am of a view that we absolutely must exploit technology to get the maximum benefit for throughput of trains and exploiting digital signalling systems and optimal braking acceleration curves and all the other things you get from automation, but that actually the thing that defines our service provision in London, which I'm very proud of, and I've always said so, is having people.
I'm not advocating staffless trains. And this second time I'm not actually advocating driverless trains either, but I think you've hit the nail on the head in respect of you can only really grind out these real advantages and close working and maximum frequencies by having trains that are automatic, that virtually drive themselves. We know that on the Elizabeth line, the central core will be automatic.
Yeah.
So, as a result of that, one thing I'm asking for the assurance that all the trains that we buy in future will have that capability. But I'm not saying we have to. But even if we were to go to driverless trains, it doesn't mean to say we wouldn't want to have, as we have on the DLR, a captain on the train to take over if really needed.
That's exactly right, and I think you're quite right to say that we will absolutely exploit technology as it exists, and I can't imagine we will buy any new train that won't be fully automatic to correspond with new modern signalling systems. But as you rightly say, that's not the same as not having a fully qualified person on the train.
And just a cheeky last question, really. I'm sure you would have seen that we released our future transport report. Have you had a chance to read it yet?
I haven't read it in detail. But I know the team is churning it through, and I've asked for a full briefing before I do read it myself. It's always helpful for me when I'm given some pointers by some of the experts in my team. But I very much look forward to it. I welcome it. For the avoidance of, I hugely welcome it, actually. I think it's a really important contribution, as all your contributions are very helpful to me in what I'm trying to do.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member O'Connell.
Yes, thank you. On this, continuing the subject of the underground, and the subject matter is particularly around extending the night tube services which TfL continue to run and are welcome very much by Londoners. But it was touched upon earlier around falling numbers, notwithstanding the seasonal fall we've seen at the moment, but the actual trend of falling numbers. Passenger numbers fallen 2.1% over the past year, ergo income would also have fallen. Has that, and that is the underground and also the night tube. So in that context, is that having an effect on the service being financially sustainable?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is that clearly the benefits of the night tube aren't just purely financial in the moment of the night. The nighttime economy is growing hugely in London, which is great for London, good for the UK, good for jobs. So we reckon so far, and this is a conservative estimate, some 3,600 new jobs created with a contribution of 170 million to London's economy in the first 12 months. And very importantly as well, the night tube does give journey choices to people who work and serve the London economy on a Friday and Saturday night. And I think it's really important. You know, I often think of the provision of public transport from an individual human being perspective. If you're working a dead late or very early shift in cleaning out a restaurant after everybody else has been there enjoying themselves and you're doing a very critical job, actually the fact you can get home faster by the night tube and now by the night East London line as well, extended as we know to Highbury and Islington just a couple of weeks ago. If you can do that just a couple of days a week, that can give you real valuable additional time with your family. And I think that's a really important imperative that is beyond the direct, immediate financial return. The other thing I would say is that it allows people who might not normally use the underground service to experience it, and again the knock-on effect, which is a bit hard to quantify, except the knock-on effect of then people saying, actually I'm going to now return to the tube, which I might not have used for many years, and try it during the daytime and other times as well, and therefore create additional new journeys there as well. So I think this is going to continue to grow. I've no doubt that the connection that we've seen is a bit too early to say. I did ask to look at some figures actually just the other day, Steve, in terms of what the connection, the very critical connection the East London line doing was to Highbury and Islington was delivering for overall increase in ridership, because I think that very nighttime focused line of route on the north of the East London line in particular is crucial, linking to the Victoria line. Haven't yet seen those figures, a bit too early to say, but I think we're very confident that will make a material difference.
Of course, I mean, the reason you said it is welcome, but I think the question really was around, it's probably too early to judge this, it's around, this is a relatively new model, and it's around the sustainability of the model. Yeah. Should the numbers fall and rise. Your point was a very well made one about clearly it's a benefit of people who, nighttime economy, particularly people who work late, but of course the night tube and the tube itself has its limitations. To areas where I represent, and clearly I think some conversations were around how you improve the night bus services to co-link in to those good people that are leaving their places of work, appearing at, say, I don't know, Brixton or Malden in whatever time. How's that link up with either night buses or very early buses, bus services generally?
I think that's something we continue to keep under review. I mean, it is again one of the issues that we look at with the bus service more generally, is how we have configured some bus routes, as you know, for Friday and Saturday night as a result of that, to ensure they respond to those new termini, which wouldn't necessarily be critical pickup points at previously on a Friday and Saturday night. So we've looked at that. There's also the whole issue about ensuring onward travel by other means, private hire vehicles and other means, and how we ensure that is part of the overall offering for people as well, so people feel safe and secure when they leave the safe and secure environment of a tube station and continue their onward journey. So I think that's part of the overall mix, and it is something, Steve, we keep continually under review, because there will be areas that as demand fluctuates that we just need to do things in a slightly different way.
Thank you. on the same subject, this is really about complaints. I think you were in front of us a year or so ago, and I think you commented that there was 119 or 120 complaints from people, and I think we've got constituency members who represent it. I probably wish that some of my constituents had the chance to complain about a tube rumbling past their house, but we don't even have that opportunity. But anyway, having said all that, the fact is the night tube would bring noise. I did text Assemblymember Devonish because I know he feels quite strongly about this, as do others. That was a year ago. Are you still receiving complaints, and how are you addressing those?
Well, we are still receiving some complaints. I have to say that since 2014, obviously we've been working very hard to reduce the noise from our track, and we continue to work with local residents and representatives in the areas affected. We've taken noise and vibration readings at properties affected by rail noise at over 300 locations. We put in over 12,000 resilient track fastenings in areas where we've had the more serious ground-borne vibration. We've removed rail joints where we didn't require them, because that's actually the thing that gives a bit of the vibration as the train passes over. Actually, we put in already some 2 kilometres of premium rail steel, which is a higher constituency of rail form, which actually does also suppress the noise a bit. And we've trialled some innovative rail noise reduction technology as well, such as noise suppression systems. And so we've a whole list of areas: Mornington Crescent, Highbury, Islington, South Wimbledon, Camden Town, Green Park, where we've got very specific plans going forward in the course of this year, right through this year actually, to kind of continue to track those areas of the highest priority.
With the significance of the routes, 119 complaints is 119 unhappy families, but I guess I can say this probably, that the numbers don't seem to be very, very big, and hopefully they're reducing, and hopefully Joanne, are you going to come...
Questioned whether they were accurate numbers last time.
Okay, you may wish to come in on it in a minute.
I think a bit, it's not the same, of course, and I wouldn't want to diminish the importance of bus safety, but the principle is the same, that every one complaint we do take seriously. I take it extraordinarily seriously, because I do recognise this is life affecting for people, and therefore we have to. That's why the sort of work that I've asked the engineering team to do is so important, to apply this technology. I'm very fortunate now, the guy that runs the underground, unlike his predecessor, is an engineer, and therefore can get to grips with this. Mark Wilde is really getting to grips with this. I know he's personally obsessed with this issue and the science behind tube rail vibration and noise. So we're doing a lot of work here.
No, I've had quite a friendly intemperate text from Tony Devonish, actually saying that he had, for his residents, actually it's getting to a situation where it's deeply affecting their lifestyle, how life experience, should I say, how they're going to bring it to an end. Grinding alone isn't working. So clearly it is an issue, and I wanted that input from someone who's experiencing it as well as others. So it is important, and I'm hearing that you're attending to it, and I know others will comment. My last question really is...
Stephen, can I just ask, did anyone else want to come in on
I've given lots of pointers to people who want to come in if they want to.
Joanne, do you want to
Good,
come in?
right, I'll defer.
I'm still getting complaints from Seven Sisters on the Victoria line. I think you've ground the track there at least once, possibly twice. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah.
But I'm still getting complaints. I suppose it's what else can you try at those places and these new noise suppression systems? I'm assuming they are expensive, so you can't put them everywhere. But I'm going to make a plea for that, because I'm now getting new complaints from that area about sleep disturbance in particular.
Yes.
But can I ask about? So I would ask you about that. But secondly, about the complaints as well, because we did have concerns, because if it was only 190, I think I must have had about a fifth of them in that one small spot. So I think we raised the issue about whether the complaints were actually being counted correctly. But even if we take just your 120 or so, do you know how many have been actually resolved? I think you've measured and it's actually have been resolved, or is it just that you think that people have complained so often that they're just not bothering anymore? Because that is a danger as well.
Add to Joanne's, will you consider floating track, as they've put under the Barbican, in certain cases to try to deal with the noise?
Vibration.
Just let me. Can I pick up Caroline's question just first? So on floating track, that is actually very technically difficult to retrofit. Floating track, that is actually quite a challenge, but it's a fair question. On the fact that people may have just given up, which I think is a less polite way of saying what you just said. I think that is something we've got to look at, and you know that's why I think continuing close work with you when you get these complaints and ensuring that we are effectively dealing with them. You know, I have this very detailed breakdown of individual locations here of what the mean noise level is, northbound and southbound, what the specific intervention is by literally by the metre of track form and what it happens to be. Sometimes, of course, unwittingly, when you do some work at one part of the line of route, there is a reverberation that then goes down because the nature of sound and vibration in a tube tunnel is such that the echoes and the feedback of sound behave in very odd ways, which is beyond my be at O-level physics to describe to you, but it's kind of a very technically complex formula that we apply. But I do think we've got to continue to be alert to this. I mean, I absolutely would hate to think that we're in a position where people are having just miserable nights, 2 nights a week on the basis of them not feeling that their complaint was at least being heard and where possible actively responded to. So if we sense that, then please do keep raising it.
And I think the issue as being a constituency member is that I get complaints, I raise them with you. Yeah. I often get, well, there's nothing we can do, or at some point, I'm going to have to say to these residents, actually, do I have to tell her, say you're just going to live with it now, because that's not really acceptable either. Well,
I understand. So it's a well-made point. I mean, I'm more than happy to have a sort of regroup, perhaps a face-to-face with Mark, actually with yourself, Joanne, might be helpful, just to kind of see if we can resolve some of those very specific issues, which obviously are not unique to the location you're describing at Seven Sisters, but particularly prevalent there. Yeah.
Thank you.
Just 2 things. Firstly, to what extent is a line tested before it's open? Is it conceivable that a line could be so old, so nosy, so deep, so above ground that it can't be used for the night tube?
I think that's anything's conceivable. I think that is conceivable. I think the reality is that as we develop new trains, for example. So I alluded to earlier on the modernisation of the Circle District, Hammersmith City and Metropolitan lines. I mean, these new trains, 191 new trains, UK built, of course, are extraordinarily quieter than both in terms of noise and vibration than the ones that they replaced on the 3 lines that they've been put in place in. So I think there's always things we can do better in some locations, but actually I think generally speaking, as technology moves forward, you get a lower level of...
But my point is, are we testing for this? So we're going to open up a new line, we're going to expose X hundreds of thousands of Londoners to potentially life-changing levels of noise. Are we testing for it? Are we saying in advance? Because the problem with this problem, even as a non-constituency member, I received a complaint as well. That's how deeply rooted this is. I know for a fact that 119 is not the level of complaints because entire communities complain en masse. So that's reducing your numbers. So that's one thing. The point I'm trying to make is it's a very serious problem. What steps are taken to mitigate it? Because if you know you're going to open a line and you do the testing before the line's open, obviously you minimise the complaints. Because the problem you run, Londoners are now beginning to talk about the noise of the night tube. And you are using the reputational battle before you start if you don't do some work before you open a new line.
Well, I think it's a reasonable point. I think I'm certainly ambitious to think that as we introduce new technology and modern signalling systems, that we will be able to extend the reach of the night tube services going forward. We're some way away from being able to do that, and I think it is a worthwhile question to ask as to what testing we could do over lines of route before we make the decision to do it. I think it's certainly something I'll take away and have a look at.
And just as a plea, I think if you include communities where these lines run through, you'll get a much better response from the public about the positive aspect of the night tube, because of course it has great positives, but the noise is a very particular thing, so communities have to be involved in that conversation.
I understand, yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Sorry, can I just pitch in finally? because I did organise a meeting with the Mayor a couple of months ago, I think it was, and a number of members attended. It seems that in some respects you have got a bit of a handle on the vibration aspect, and there's more technology to mitigate that. But in relation to noise, and certainly in my manner, as I would say, I and the residents would absolutely agree, we cannot fault the efforts of your team. They've been amazing in the amount of work and effort and energy that they've put into reducing the noise, but all of the mitigation has had virtually no effect whatsoever. And it just, my question is just what, I think it's really based on what Joanne was saying, what happens when we get to the end of the line, you know, when we just have exhausted every technological solution and still people are suffering over 50 decibels of noise? What do we do?
It's a very difficult area, isn't it? Because as many colleagues have rightly alluded to, the benefits of the night tube for the wider community are significant. Equally, you never want to see individuals going through a challenge. I think if we get to the point where we genuinely have reached the end of the line of what technology can deliver for us, then we probably need to have a case-by-case discussion as to what else we might do, or what we do going forward. I don't have the answer to that. It's a very difficult question. Again, I would just reassure you that we will continue to do whatever we can within the bounds of known technology as it exists to try and ensure that night tube can operate effectively, but also that people can live and sleep, importantly, alongside it.
Right. So whilst I won't make any suggestions as to what other mitigation could be done outside of what you can do to the track itself, but when do we say that we have actually exhausted all alternative, let's call it engineering solutions? When do we say that?
Well, I think that will depend on the individual circumstance. So I could make a generic, rather glib comment, which wouldn't be helpful, I don't think, Chair, that says, well, obviously once you've done the, you put in this new type of rail form, you put in the sort of noise suppression systems, well, kind of you've done what you've done. But actually, there are often engineering tweaks that you can do in and around that, where actually, there's an additional sort of absorption pad that you can put in on a particular block joint or bit when the track changes from one rail to another, or over a set of points or whatever. There are things that you can consider doing. So I think it will depend case by case as to what the geometry of the track is at the individual location.
Are you prepared to accept that there is a point when you have to say there's no more that we can do, and at that point you're prepared to have another conversation, a different conversation with the affected residents?
I think inevitably we have to be honest and upfront with people. If we've genuinely done everything we can, there's something more that could be done, absolutely. And it goes back to what Joanne said, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, that's helpful actually, thank you. Sorry, Steve.
Right, just last question for me. We mentioned earlier around the financial challenges that TfL are facing, and that's been well rehearsed, but now we're on the subject of upgrades, capacity upgrades, and I mentioned a figure earlier, and we've got a list of very significant underground tube upgrades, totalling, my rough figures, around £4.5 billion. Now, we commented on losing direct grant, we commented on the fares effect on your income. Given those difficulties, are we likely to see parts of your upgrade programmes being cancelled or delayed?
No, is my assertion. I'll let Simon perhaps say a couple of words, but my view is this is a fully costed capital programme. It's a huge imperative. The Piccadilly line trains were built in 1973. They are ancient by any sense of that meaning, and they need to be replaced. The signalling system operates on a pianola roll, literally, at Earl's Court, where it turns round on a barrel, and in every hole in the roll is an individual signalling operation on the ground happening. It's incredibly safe, but it's incredibly prehistoric. Well, not quite prehistoric, but incredibly so we need to replace it. We need to just replace it in terms of value for money and affordability, but also, very importantly, for the capacity enhancement, and this does give you 60% capacity enhancement. We know how to do this now. The first part of the Circle and Hammersmith and City line between Edgware Road and Euston Square will be running with the new signalling by the end of this calendar year. This is the envy of railways around the world in terms of how this technology has been applied. We have the very best team anywhere in the world doing
the
this.
question, I think we kind of get that.
Sorry, I occasionally like to give my team some credit because they do.
We love to hear all
They do.
this.
I'm sorry. I do get carried away. My passion sometimes gets ahead of me. But actually, the reason, the point I'm making is that not just from a financial imperative it is crucial, not just from a mayor's transport strategy perspective it is crucial, not just from a value for money in terms of operational maintenance it is crucial, but it's also crucial for maintaining the skills base that we have, and very importantly I think for encouraging more young people, particularly if I can say young women, into those STEM subject areas, into engineering. People will know that separately. I'm obsessed with all of this, so we've got to do it.
The question, Simon, for you is, can we still afford it?
Yeah. Yes.
Give me a bit
so
more.
in our 2017 business plan, we fully funded the purchase of the Piccadilly line rolling stock.
Right.
And that, as Mike and I said back in January, we've committed to making that procurement later this year.
Right. Okay. I think I've seen other members want to comment
Yeah,
on that. I'll just let that be on that one for me.
So at the Mayor's question time, the issue of Carillion was raised with the Mayor. I know you've got very limited exposure there, but the Mayor did suggest that you are looking at your outsourced contracts and seeing whether any of them would be better delivered by taking them back in-house. Could you just give us a little bit more? Is that a comprehensive look at every contract, or when contracts are up for renewal?
So shall I take one, Mike? So we look at our critical suppliers on a regular basis, and we look at the plans we have on those critical suppliers, and when those contracts come up for tender. We've got a forward look also about the contracts we have to let this year and next year, and in every one of those we make a decision about whether we contract with the private sector to do things on our behalf or do them ourselves, based upon what is a combination of the best overall value for money, but also who is best placed to do that. So in some areas where we do have better skills and it's cheaper for us to do it ourselves, which was the contract I mentioned earlier about bringing maintenance back in-house, we will do so. But in other areas where we don't have the skills, or other people, or there's a deeper market pool that could do that far more efficiently and effectively than we could ever do that ourselves, it makes far more sense in a value for money term, and also in terms of getting the right outcome with people that are experienced in doing those things, to contract with people to deliver them on our behalf. So we do it. We constantly reassess those decisions.
But you are looking at
Yes.
those, because I'm thinking of things like that perhaps aren't such specialist skills that you'll have to go to the market, but for example taking cleaning back in-house and so forth. Is that something you'd be looking at?
I think cleaning we've actually just sort of had a much more holistic facilities management contract put out to just awarded that. But I think, just for example, and Simon did allude to it earlier on in the wider discussion on finances, the last remaining bit of the old PPP with the maintenance contract for the Jubilee Northern and Piccadilly, that's now come back in-house. I mean, that's a significant saving to us for doing that in-house. So that's the type of thing that we need to be always on the ball looking at, and I've asked Simon and the team to ensure that we are actively looking before we automatically get into a re-procurement process, that we have a kind of, if you like, a gate to go through, that we automatically ask the question about what is the best value for money in individual contract by contract basis.
Because I hope you realise, well, you will do, that value for money doesn't necessarily mean lowest price.
No.
It's often the quality and the
and that's why we use
security
that
of
terminology.
employees.
Exactly right. That terminology is important.
Yeah.
You're quite right. Yeah.
Sean, did you speak?
Yeah, just earlier on we spoke about changes in inflation rates affecting your forecast, etc. Has there been anything else that's impacted on your income that may affect these capital investments going forward? So when you set your budget up and it was all fine, those assumptions were made, have any of those assumptions changed significantly enough to put any of the projects at risk?
So between publishing the business plan in December and the current budget process that we are taking to our board later this month, there haven't been any significant changes in terms of the underlying assumptions. So we are expecting to present a budget to our board that is, except for those additional items that the Mayor has chosen to fund in terms of additional money for the boroughs in terms of lips and additional bus driver facilities, there are no changes to what we're planning to do, and there's no change really to the budgeted position in terms of the net operating deficit for next year. So as things stand today, you know, the current expectations in terms of the underlying things that affect both our income and our costs are that the assumptions we made in the business plan hold true, and therefore we'll be able to fully fund everything on the investment programme that we're looking to do. What I should also say though is, as we have demonstrated over the last 2 years, those forecasts are obviously just forecasts, but our budget is what we absolutely, Mike and I won't allow the organisation to miss its budget, and we will make additional savings in year where we need to in order to deliver the important investment and services that we need to deliver by finding cheaper ways to do things.
Okay, I suppose the last thing I'd like to say is the passenger number estimates have been generous in the past and we've missed. How confident are going forward that we have a better idea of the reality of how that might be?
They're within 2%, I think.
Yes.
It's fair to say, and I think that's an extraordinarily good, actually, projection of passenger numbers, particularly when you do get some external factors such as the terrible terrorist events that I alluded to, which were material in terms of our passenger numbers last year, which were unforeseen. I will assure you, though, because it is a very fair question, I will assure you that I have insisted, and Simon has endorsed that insistence, on a extraordinarily prudent approach to our demand projections in the business plan and the budget, so that we are at the lower end of optimism. In fact, you could argue at the pessimistic end, so that clearly if there's any upside, that is positive. So, but the budget is based on the very pessimistic projection because, you know, this is the first time actually we've seen some softening of demand apart from the small blip in 2008 for some 20 years.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
Right, that pretty much brings us to the end. I just want to ask you a quick question, but I don't necessarily want the answer right now. I've had a number of complaints recently about the delays on the central line. Could you look into that and give me reasons why that is, and hopefully also an assurance that things will improve?
I can give you the assurance that things will improve because we've got a capacity enhancement programme for the central line improvement programme that is in place because we have some challenges with the trains. That plan is now in place and will definitely give you some improvement. But I'll ask Mark Wilde perhaps to give you a separate note on that.
Okay, thank you. Right, well that brings us to the end of that section. I've got a couple of bits of housework to do just in relation to item number 7, which is the Travel Watch Performance Report. We've noted the Transport Committee Work Programme. Date of next meeting, 16th of May. Any other business? There is just one other bit of other business that I'd like to do. First of all, thanks to Mike and Simon for coming. It's been very informative, very helpful. A very big thank you to all those in the gallery for coming along, and also the committee, because it's been quite a struggle for most of us to get in, so it says a lot about you guys for coming in. This is my last meeting as chair of this committee, so thank you very much for all your help and support as a committee. It's been great working with you, very collegiate I thought. But I just want to put on record my big thanks to Caroline, who has been a real brick actually. Has been fantastic vice chairman, and I actually couldn't have done it without you, so thank you very much indeed, Caroline. Thank you.
Thank you for your work. Daniel Gavel.
GLA Chamber Sound. GLA Chamber